Down airs. There's some of the more uniformly designed moves among the Smash roster, but does that mean they have uniform animation quality? I'm not so sure, but today, let's find out as we dive into every down air animation in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. As a reminder, especially because it's been a while since I've done one of these, we're ranking these animations based on everything they bring to the table, so technical execution, creativity, sense of impact, sound design when it matters, everything. Let's get into it. Downers are inherently one of the more satisfying move types to connect among the Smash roster, but there's always been something about this one right from the very start. Throughout this entire animation, Captain Falcon is a coiled spring. He comes way in, shoots out in only a couple of frames, and then even recoils back inwards from that. And then at the end, he does a satisfying flip with a nice little hefty landing behind it. I'll show it from this side too, but it barely even matters because the silhouette alone is so iconic in the Smash series, along with the knee. Like, Captain Falcon does have some of the best silhouette work among the entire series. Sakurai's gone on record talking about the importance of silhouettes before, which is encouraging for a fighting game director. That's exactly what you'd hope to see, and yeah, this just nails it. Anyone surprised this is getting S tier? Alright, now let's look at Mario. Okay, so this is a very odd concept for a danner. It's not a weird thing to have on Mario's kit in general. Spinning is nothing new to him, but this really does look more like, say, a neutral air, or maybe the special move it started out as. But it's what he's got to work with, and for the record, I think from a technical perspective, it's actually quite well done. There's a really nice, smooth sense of momentum all throughout the spin. I love the way he coils up and then, again, launches out like a spring at the very end, even though this is a totally different animation concept from Captain Falcon. Animation fundamentals still tend to transfer over no matter what you're doing. The landing animation looks very natural. If it comes near the end, you know, it just launches off that, I guess you'd call it a double arm thrust or whatever he's doing anyways. It looks more like it was tailored to interrupt the end of the animation than the beginning of it, but you know, honestly, it's still pretty good. This is a kill move, and it's not the absolute strongest feeling one in the game. That's an issue that many multi-hit moves have. But I will say that strong, again, like coiled spring pose he strikes does help. Okay, so the technical execution is good. The concept is strange, though, especially on a character like Mario, who's supposed to be kind of this fundamental teach you the game sort of character. It's weird to have a danner do that. Admittedly, you could argue that he's been branched off from that role a bit as time's gone on, but he still has a projectile, an anti-projectile, very basic straightforward moves for the most part, and then suddenly there's just a couple of weird ones in there. His forward air acts weird and this one acts weird, but whereas forward air deviates from the standard for the sake of being awesome, down air not being a spike, I would say certainly from a more casual perspective makes it less cool in most players' eyes, and that's fundamentally tied into the concept. You would have a really hard time justifying that animation being a spike move. It's true they didn't even do that for his old down air animation, but it still looked more natural and much more like how you'd expect a down air to work. I still like it for what it is, but I feel like if they were going to keep the spinning aspect, they could have maybe done a bit more with it, you know, give it some flair, give it some Mario Galaxy particle effects. It may well have started off as more of an old school reference, but I think it really could use the style. I'm kind of torn between A and B tier on this one, but because it's so well done technically, well enough that it actually makes a multi-hit kill move feel pretty satisfying to land, that's often an uphill battle, I'm gonna let it sneak into A tier. I guess for comparison, let's look at the other Marios. See, Dr. Mario, they went hog wild in the other direction. They took what wasn't a spike and turned it into a really hefty spike, which I do appreciate. I've always thought this animation, while it's fun, looks a bit awkward. They're having him do the coiled spring thing again, and it is exceptionally well done here. He really does just absolutely explode into the attack. I like the way his stethoscope interacts with it. And if you're doing it just standing in place like this, honestly, it looks pretty good. The pose he ends up in is a bit strange looking, but that's part of the charm of it. What does strike me as a bit funny looking about it, though, is just how straight his entire body is. So you do want to be extended out, like hyperextended when you're doing the actual attack, but with a character like Captain Falcon, he's allowed to come back in afterwards, and that makes the entire thing feel a bit more elastic and fluid and organic when he's moving to the side, whereas Dr. Mario, I don't know, there's some weird juxtaposition for it. It almost feels a bit artificial, I guess would be the word I would use. Like, he doesn't really look like he's maintaining any momentum from the side-to-side motion. Smash characters have no mechanism to keep track of that in the animation, but you can design an animation so that it fits more naturally into that momentum. For the landing animation, he does hit the ground decently hard, certainly harder than Mario, but still maybe feels a bit too in control compared to how kind of splayed out he is during the actual attack. I don't know. It's not bad, but even his regular, like, heavy landing animation that you just saw there, I feel like that looks a bit heftier than this one, whereas this is a pretty hefty attack where he lets himself get out of control a bit for a fairly sluggish character. Feeling good to land does make up for a lot of shortcomings, though, and Yeah, and then we get to Luigi's, and I gotta say, in comparison, a little disappointing. He strikes a decently strong pose. That strongman pose actually looks somewhat reminiscent of Captain Falcon's, although the silhouette definitely doesn't come across as strongly with the spin. I didn't even necessarily always know that's what he was doing, and it really does lack a sense of power. There's not any of that coiled spring sensation here. You know, he does bring his legs up to his chest a little bit, but just barely, and the spin does rob some of the momentum too. This is a spiking Danner, and it does look like it, at least in the sense that he's aiming his energy downwards, but it doesn't really look that much like it if I was told this always sent them sideways, which is what actually always happens on the ground now. Yeah, if it only ever did that, it wouldn't really be that surprising. And more disappointing than anything else to me, this one just lacks so much personality compared to a lot of Luigi's other animations. You know, you've got his up air landing animation where he lands on his head and then springs back up, and you've got his forward air landing animation where he hurts his hand. And then for Danner, he just kind of plops. Not much sense of springing back into place. The way he recovers from it actually looks a little bit like it's going against his natural momentum. There's not really a flow back into position. And speaking of momentum, when he is chambering for the attack, he does bring himself back a little bit into position, but it's not that dramatic. It's not that cartoony, which is what I want from Luigi. You know, he could be bringing his arms and shoulders back way further than that. There are far less cartoony characters on the roster who exaggerate their attacks more than this one does. Dr. Mario, I'm gonna go A tier. Maybe a bit controversial. I really do like connecting it. It's a fun addition for Ultimate, but it has some flaws. For Luigi, I didn't really come in expecting to be this harsh to it, but honestly, F tier. I'm going to be looking at a lot of spikes today, which feel way heftier and more satisfying to land than his does, and the way he could have gotten away with that was by being funny instead, but it's not really funny, or particularly well done technically, or particularly well done in really any way. Let's compare him to Falco, another conventional spinning spike. See, now we're back on track here. That coiled spring is back in full force. I love the particle effects. I love the little body slant. It gives it kind of a casual vibe almost to it, which makes sense. Falco is a very, you know, slick, cool kind of character. Yeah, look at this. Look at how much he tucks in and then just explodes into position and carries that momentum so naturally into the spinning action. This is how you do that kind of attack. The landing animation has a nice little skid out to it, strikes a pose. I will definitely say it does look better facing to the right. If you do it from this side, his head probably could have turned a bit more. I should say his entire torso and his head along with it could have turned a bit more, just so he gave more of the vibe of looking off his shoulder, because some of that effect is lost. If they had him turn his entire torso more into the ending, if he was doing it from this side, he wouldn't be facing the camera anymore. So they basically decided we're gonna have one side look really cool and sacrifice the other side for it. I don't love that approach, but at full gameplay scale and speed, it doesn't really matter that much just because it's so quick. It is a nice little detail they could have added, though. There was probably a better solution. Pretty minor nitpick overall, but feels great to land, feels very natural where the sweet spot versus the sour spot's gonna be. Yeah, that's an S tier. So I guess we might as well do the other Star Fox characters, Fox and Wolf. Fox has a similar concept to Falco, that famous drill attack, but unlike Falco, this has no spiking hitbox on it. It's always gonna drag you down or send you outwards. And I really like that as time's gone on, they've emphasized that difference more. Fox does still have a tiny bit of wind up into the attack, but mostly he just sort of goes straight into it, which could seem bumpy and jarring and not really look natural, but it does. They've handled it well. There's still just enough of a sense of build-up. And the much faster startup also does a good job fitting into Fox's overall personality and playstyle. You know, it didn't really used to work like this. Back in Melee, Fox and Falco had essentially the same animation, but Falco spiked and Fox didn't. And it worked fine, but I definitely think it works better now. It feels much more intuitive. Similar kind of skid-out motion in the landing animation. Unlike with Falco, Fox's head on this side is basically facing straight towards the camera, so I think you're probably sacrificing a similar amount on this side. You know, I'm actually going to say I like that better. Facing directly away from the camera feels kind of cool and mysterious in its own right, whereas Falco's it felt a bit more like he was supposed to be looking over his shoulder towards you, but just didn't quite get there. Maybe a bit of arthritis kicking in. And then we get to Wolf, who completely abandons any of that spinning kick concept in favor of a downwards double claw swipe. Wolf is not an ambidextrous character because he's got that blaster, and I think it does hurt him a decent amount in this animation because on this side, he's facing the camera, and I think it looks pretty strong. On this side, though, he's facing away from the camera, and I think that actually looks a little bit clunky. His head kind of disappears. There's something about this animation from either side that feels slightly off to me, and I think what's going on is the way he lifts his hands up and prepares for the attack is just a bit unmotivated. He's not like building up power or whatever, you know what I mean? He's just kind of hanging out there. Probably comes across better at full speed. Yeah, he just holds his hands above his head, but doesn't really seem to have a lot of justification for doing so. Why are you not either winding up to deliver a more powerful strike or just attacking right away. I always love Wolf's particle effects, but again, they look much better on this side because on this side, his body is blocking some of them. That's a shame. He does have a very strong, well-defined ending pose. I appreciate that, and he's got a good landing animation too. It feels nice and chunky. And I always love Wolf's metal claw sound design, and it makes it feel good to land. But overall, it's a mix of excellent and surprisingly mediocre, so I think I'm going to say B tier. Fox is joining Falco up in S tier, though, for surprisingly different reasons, but the end result is still a fantastic animation. Let's look at Pokemon Trainer, a few different ideas in one, including another drill. Yeah, Squirtle's got this funny-looking thing here, which, unlike with Fox and Falco, is slightly off-axis, like it feels a bit unbalanced. Kind of suits him, though. Squirtle's animation concept is this very acrobatic, agile character who occasionally gets in just a bit over his head, so this sort of deal, it does fit him. I do wish it had a better wind up though. This is another Fox-esque one where he starts it up very quickly, but look at the way his arms snap out and then snap in almost instantly afterwards. Feels slightly jerky actually. Once he's actually tucked in and starts moving, I think it does look pretty good. I like the concentrated look on his face. I like that landing pose. It doesn't have the same kind of skid out that someone like Fox and Falco's does, but that's because he's landing on all four of his limbs, so there's more friction. It's better controlled, and I love the way that he lands on his feet just a couple frames ahead of time, which you'd expect for a butt-first animation. And then his arms bear more of the brunt as he continues to go down. Doesn't feel that hefty to land, but it's not supposed to. This is a combo move. Ivysaur's downer animation is, it's fine. It's a very smooth motion, but it almost feels like it shouldn't be so much. I like the flex that Ivysaur's body and especially the bulb do when the spores come out, but the thing is, that feels like it should disrupt Ivysaur's momentum a lot more than it actually does. It still just feels like one very straightforward front flip, whereas to me, it lends itself more to the idea of a straightforward front flip until the bulb launches and Ivysaur has some rotational momentum that suddenly gets a huge boost, and then it needs to try and sort of catch itself in the second half. That would give it a lot more personality and I think look a bit more natural. Now, to be fair, the bulb is launching directly underneath it, so there's not as dramatic an effect, but this still feels like too little. This animation also actually has a very big sour spot on it, but you couldn't really tell just from looking at it where the sour spot's supposed to be. If you just had to guess, you'd probably intuitively say closer to the edge of the cloud, and you'd be right, but it's hard to say exactly what counts as the edge of the cloud in this case, especially because this move was patched. Its sour spot used to be smaller and then was increased over time, and of course the animation wasn't compensated. I do love the particle effects, the combination of those spores and then those leaves flying off everywhere, and then the little after images too, and the actual act of launching the spores out of Ivysaur feels satisfying, but again, if there was more momentum disruption, it would feel more satisfying. For up air, that concept comes through much more effectively. Look at how much more disruptive that is. For down air, you could argue it's more of a gameplay balance factor because there's not supposed to be as much momentum alteration, but there is some, and this is an animation video. I don't really need to care about gameplay balance, and yeah, up air, that just feels like what this kind of spore cloud should be doing. And then we get to Charizard, a very conventional stomp downwards. It does feel decently in character for Charizard. It's not an especially creative attack, but it does get the job done. Nice wind up with the one foot that is going to be doing the attack, and I love the follow through with the back leg kicking up too. Very strong, distinct pose. The landing animation works pretty well too. He hits the ground decently hard. The way he gets up is, yeah, solid. It's not incredible. He's not like heaving himself up, which for a heavyweight you might expect. It is relatively smooth and natural looking though. You only have a couple of frames of animation to work with for a move like this, so there's really only so much they can do. I think they could have done slightly better, but it's not really worth complaining about. And this one feels quite good to land. It's the way that he sticks that one foot out there in that really strong pose. It lets you feel that impact. Squirtle, I'm going to say A tier. It's fun and it works pretty well. Ivysaur, I'm kind of feeling C tier, but I do really like the concept behind it, so I think that bumps it up to B. And then Charizard's another A tier. There's nothing particularly wrong with it, but there's no X factor pushing it into S. You know, maybe if the landing animation had earth particles coming up, so it could sort of be an earthquake attack, something along those lines like his down smash does, and it came with a shockwave hitbox, that'd do it. Or something completely different that feels more like Pokemon. This is a well done take on a generic concept, but it's not an incredible take on it like Captain Falcon has. Let's do Min Min, our first dive kick of the video. This one's got a very static, like wind up, go feeling to it, which I think fits pretty well. It's got a bit of a shockwave hitbox on it, if I can line that up. Yeah, which does match the concept. Min Min really does look like she's plummeting to the ground. Min Min is selling this one really well. Look at how far that leg is tucked back, and then she immediately snaps into that very strong stance. The landing animation feels like she's hitting the ground really hard, but is still fully in control the entire time. Another unfortunate instance where it doesn't read as well on this side, especially because her arm is actually covering up her head from the back. It's not that big a deal though. Min-Min's in kind of a weird spot because a lot of her moves have relatively slow frame data, but then a lot of her more acrobatic stuff is actually quite nimble. So this one here is somewhere in between. It's got more the frame data of her arm attacks, but it's one of her acrobatic moves. It's hard to complain about it too much because what we have here does really work for her. A tier. Let's take a look at one of those faster dive kicks. Zero Suit Samus. Yeah, faster startup on this one, but relatively straightforward and similar overall. A very distinct, firm pose and quite a hard plummet into the ground. Has that shockwave element too. I gotta say, the way she employs the rocket boots on this one is quite weird. If you look at it from this perspective, you can see the angle is way off on these. Those should actually be boosting her back up into the air. Like, that's not a small detail. It's a really weird call. There are several better concepts they could have gone with if they wanted to incorporate the rocket heels. They could have had her do more of a head first dive. They could have had her tuck her feet up to her butt and do more of like a knee strike forward. Or they could have just not used the jet propulsion at all and had her do a conventional dive kick like every other character gets away with. Like, it's a shame. It feels satisfying to go into. The posing is great. The landing animation works really well, but that sucks. I'm going F tier. I don't know what else to say. That single-handedly kills the animation for me. They're completely going against their own self-imposed concept. This wasn't even something she does in Metroid. Like, they gave her the rocket heels back in Smash 4 as an original creation, and they really just haven't utilized them that well. This may be the worst example, though. Alright, let's do something totally different. Yoshi. I love this. This has always been such a fun concept for a move, such a fun adaptation, and it looks so innocuous in this situation compared to when you're connecting it. And it's just like, what the hell happened? The flutter jump is one of Yoshi's oldest signature moves, and while yeah, it is also used conventionally in Smash, it's such a distinctive animation that when it came time to give him a down air, what else were they gonna do? It fits in great. There's a nice wind up on it, and I like that Yoshi looks kind of pissed. The couple of frames in between the wind up and the attack actually starting up, they're not the snappiest in the entire game, but when it turns into just that foot flurry thing, it's okay. That particle effect, that smear, really helps sell it too. If he finishes it in the air, he gets a very nice, clean ending pose to it, kind of a double kick thing. And if he lands with it, it's a clumsy bailout deal, which, yeah, he's not supposed to be interrupting that. I like it. That is gonna be an S tier, I think. Let's do Sephiroth. So I was talking about strong references. This might be the most diabolical reference in the entire Smash franchise. I can't believe they went there. There's a decently long wind-up on this one where he holds a pose up for a few frames. Unlike with a character like Wolf, though, I do get the impression that he's using that time to prepare for the plunge, so I think it does read pretty well. The only possible exception is that because the pose he holds up has the sword horizontal and then the final plunge obviously has it vertical, there is a slightly jarring transition between the two where it looks like it just sort of snaps into place a bit. It's not too bad, and both the individual components are very well defined and powerful looking. The landing animation on this one is fantastic. He looks like he's cracking the earth open and maybe even cracking it open in a way that reveals life stream from within the planet, like in Final Fantasy VII. I don't know if that's what they're going for or not, or if it's just supposed to be generic glowing energy coming off the sword, but either way, it looks great. And then even after that, when he's pulling the sword out of the ground, there's also some additional dirt particles. They didn't need to do that. It's such a nice touch. The way he hits the ground looks pretty hefty too, which makes sense considering what he's just done to the person on the other side. Smooth handoff between both hands on the sword and then one on it. Bonus points if there's no clipping on it. Is there? There's a bit of clipping as it comes out of the ground. That's a shame, but not that bad. I love the sound of the sword sticking into and coming out of the stage too. It's nothing fancy, but it all flows together really nicely, and it feels good to connect with. I do wish it gave off a bit more of a sense of them being impaled on the ground, you know, some kind of custom thing where it actually sticks into them more, but that's asking for some potentially awkward implementation, and in practice the move reads fine anyways. More than fine, actually. S tier. I forgot to look at the one wing form. I don't think this has ever changed a ranking of mine, but it's worth looking at anyways. On Danner, oh, that's actually pretty good. I love the way that it flares up behind him. On landing, it could come down a little bit faster, but then again, you know, it's got a lot of air resistance. It's a wing. Could give the move a bit more style if it's sort of wrapped around him more, but you know what? It's got plenty of style as is. I don't think it needs more. Let's do Wii Fit Trainer. Wii Fit Trainer had some very distinctive choices made for her animation style where she doesn't get any kind of body breaking, you know, limbs growing and shrinking or anything like that, and she also doesn't get any kind of smear particle effects. I don't like that choice. I think it hurts her much more often than it helps her, and down air is a pretty big victim of it. Look at the way those legs just kind of snap around. Look me in the eye and tell me some smear particle effects wouldn't have made that look smoother. Yeah, I just don't think this is very well animated. Her torso comes into the chamber position before her legs do. The two halves of her body almost seem to move independently of each other. The actual snap out looks yeah, okay, not bad. I like the way her head juts down to help sell it too, even if the way her neck moves feels a bit off-putting, but yeah, the way it comes together feels kind of incohesive and jerky and unnatural, which is ironic considering the lack of particle effects is supposed to make her feel more natural. I guess that's why they decided to do that. Landing animation for this one is really heavy. On a lot of Smash characters, I would praise them for that, but isn't Wii Fit Trainer supposed to be a very balanced fighter by design? I guess they're trying to drive home the fact that she's a human, but this would fit on a lot of other contexts, but to my eyes, it seems out of place here. Am I wrong? I don't know. She lands heavily in some of her other aerials too, and it does make sense in context there more, but here, this seems to me like she could maybe even be doing a gymnastics landing and that would feel perfectly appropriate. This entire thing feels off. I don't even like the pose they went with where she holds her arms out in front of her. It makes her feel kind of unbalanced again. Yeah, this is F tier. Wii Fit Trainer consistently places pretty low on these lists, but this may well be the worst example I've looked at. Let's do Donkey Kong. Okay, so we've got another single-footed stomp kick here. This one looks about as good as they could have gotten it. I will say this seems like an attack that might have been better suited for using his arms though. DK's a gorilla, his legs aren't that big, and there is definitely a lot of body breaking going on during that attack. His leg gets way bigger, which does compensate for that to some degree, and there is actually quite a good wind up into this one. He lifts his hip and his shoulder way up and then plunges them down, and there's some nice spring-like retraction on it too. I still don't necessarily think it's the perfect concept, but maybe they wanted to avoid too much overlap with his forward air. That seems pretty reasonable, and the concept that they did go with, I think they did it just about as much justice as you could. For the landing animation, he hits the ground quite hard, and the way he gets up feels natural, and it feels really good to land. A tier. It's a nice stomp, but again, there's no X factor to it. Diddy does actually use his arms, so this double hammer fist thing is very in line with DK's forward air. I actually kind of like the way they've adapted it into a Dan air here, but on Diddy in particular, it's missing a bit of oomph. To some degree, that's justifiable because Diddy is not a particularly strong character and this is not the hardest hitting spike in the game, but there's a bit more to it than that. I can't quite put my finger on it. There's a pretty good windup on this one and a good follow through on it. I like the ending pose. You know what I think part of the problem is though? Is that his head and especially his hat are just taking too much focus away from his arms, which are actually doing the damage. Yeah, those do get lost in the silhouette a bit. Actually, his legs splaying out are a nice touch. They're monkeyish, they're cartoonish, but they do break up some of that arm swing. Am I right about that? Yeah, I think I am. I think that's what's going on. If I do it at full speed and scale, the problem becomes less obvious, but way harsher. His arms have no attention at this point. It's much more of an all-out attack than it really looks like, which could be corrected with some pretty simple changes. Although I will say for an all-out attack, that landing looks kind of controlled. The concept behind it's nothing particularly special, but you know, it is fun tying it into DK's moveset too. But I think I've got to go C tier. It's still not a particularly remarkable move, and it's got some major flaws. What about K. Rool? Let's wind down the DK squad. This is a fan favorite, and it scored very highly on my best of every animation video. It's a very Captain Falcon Ganondorf-ish pose, but exaggerated even a little bit more, and it's got some great wind up and follow through on it. And then this becomes much more obvious if you look at it in slow motion. He actually does a full body spin ahead of time. That is so unnecessary that it doesn't even really read at full gameplay speed and scale. Like, I'm not sure I could even tell you that's what he's doing, but it does subliminally add a bit more of a sense of weight to it for sure. At full speed and scale, it's actually implying the coil up more than anything else though, because it's not really contributing anything to the actual move. He stops moving after the spin and then he does the attack. The actual coiling into the chamber pose he does is not as exaggerated as some characters, but he's got that big gut in the way. He can only tuck his legs in so far. And the way he actually snaps down with his legs moving so fast and his belly extending outwards and his arms snapping down to help out, the way his head comes back, it really does sell it afterwards. The landing animation, could be heavier considering this is one of the heaviest heavyweight characters in Smash. Doesn't necessarily look unnatural, and I like the pose he ends up in. It looks almost a little bit regal, but if this shook the earth a bit more, I wouldn't be complaining. And it feels so fun to throw out and land. K. Rool's vocalizations really help with this one. That is an easy S tier. How about Joker? Joker's not the only character with this sword swipe underneath him, dagger swipe underneath him, I guess in this case. This one feels different than most of the other ones though. It's got kind of a, what would be the term I'd use, wispy feel to it? I think it's because he forms kind of a weird shape where his body sort of stops in place and his arm keeps moving almost independently. It does look very dramatic and very theatrical, and it's a strong pose, which is what you'd expect for a character like Joker, but It doesn't contribute to the strongest feeling move, and it looks just a little bit stiff, which is not what you want to see on a character like Joker, who's supposed to be very limber and fluid and acrobatic. I think if they had him arch his back even slightly more, that issue would be entirely resolved. It's a small thing, but it really does make a difference. Yeah, landing pose is very theatrical too. The way he gets up is a bit abrupt, but he is pushing off his hand. I think it's okay. That push off could definitely be better though. It's not a particularly heavy feeling move, but this is another combo tool, so that's really not that big a deal. That is, of course, until Arsene comes out, in which case it is still a combo tool, but it's also a pretty hefty spike. Some of Arsene's moves have fantastic animation synergy between him and Joker. This is not the absolute top of the line for me. It's not bad. It does create a nice streak of blue in the middle of the red, and Joker already has nice particle effects, so this is only piling onto that. But Arsene kicking downwards is what implies the spike more, and that is largely obscured by Joker. And compared to something like back air, for example, where they create these nice intersecting arcs, it gets a little bit muddled here. It's really not bad. I don't want to imply it is, but it's not his strongest. Put everything together and I'm feeling more of a B tier on this one. I do like the concept behind this animation. I think some people would probably rank it a lot higher than I do, but there's a decent amount of nitpicky stuff. How about Ryu and Ken? Let's get them in here. This is a very strange looking Danner by Smash standards. There is a reason for that though. It was adapted from a jumping attack in the Street Fighter series, just altered slightly. This is a case kind of like Diddy Kong, where I think the silhouette isn't really doing it full justice, because if you look at the way he winds up into the punch and the way he throws it out, he's actually putting a lot of force behind it. But yeah, his leg cuts some of that silhouette off and makes it look a bit stubby and therefore weak. Ryu and Ken do have some pretty distinct animation differences between them. This is not one of them. It's a pretty nice, well-defined silhouette for what it is. But what it is was always going to be kind of a blob just because of the concept, right? It's one of those situations where they did the best they possibly could have with it. I'll check the landing animation for these. That's fantastic. Wow, that might be the best one I've looked at today. Even has a bit of a flourish as he's getting back up. He tucks his arm in, so he's got two distinct poses instead of just kind of shifting from the landing position to standing. He transitions in the middle. And you've always got to appreciate Street Fighter stat design. You know, I was thinking more B tier for these, but that landing animation, I think that puts it just over the line into A. It's a solid reference, well done, just needed a bit more. That was the bit more. While we're doing Echo Fighters, Peach and Daisy, another kind of unusual Dan air attack, and I say it's unusual even for these kick flurry downwards things, which we do have other examples of on the roster. The dress ham and the particle effects more or less completely obscure her feet at full gameplay scale and speed, so this one should be a lot more ambiguous than it is, but they did a pretty good job with it anyways. You can pretty much tell exactly what's going on. They get away with some of that by cheating the dress physics a bit, although it does look very weird at quarter speed. Don't worry about that. That's interpolation. Those are frames the animators never actually put onto the character. But you can still pretty clearly see that it's moving faster than natural cloth would, but it helps impart that sense of motion in her legs a lot more than it normally would, so it's a good change. It's also a Danner that pairs very nicely with her float mechanic. I would actually say it looks a little bit more in place here than it does when she's just doing the attack normally. This is obviously a multi-hit attack. What's not nearly so obvious is that it's a multi-hit attack that has a finisher on it. Now, just from understanding how Smash tends to work, you intuit that it's there, but you have to do it from the game mechanics because you can't really do it from the animation so much. There's very little indication that the first hit is going to be any different whatsoever than the rest of them. If that was like a kick forward more or something like that, or even something else, because she doesn't always send you forward, but reverse hits are already a thing in Smash. In any case, a little bit of spice at the end would have been appreciated on this one. And then the landing animation for them is pretty good. I do like the bailout, the push off with the hand a bit on the weak side. Daisy's is identical, not even different particle effects to worry about this time around. I will say she might even be missing the final hit spice a bit more than Peach's, having her do like an aggressive kick at the end and having each of them do a different pose on that. Peach something dainty, Daisy something more aggressive. That would be the ideal scenario. That's assuming they were willing to do anything interesting with these characters whatsoever. In any case, I think they're both gonna get B tier as is. What about Pac-Man? Something similar. Yeah, Pac-Man has another quadruple kick flurry thing going on. No skirt in the way, obviously. It doesn't help nearly as much as I'd hope, though. It's functional, but his feet just kind of seem to slide around his torso. I don't think that's actually what's happening. If I have it right, Pac-Man is not designed like a character like, say, Kirby, whose feet are literally just allowed to freely move around his body, same with his arms. So I think it's rotational momentum on the hips. It's kind of hard to tell, but in either case, the way that his body obscures his hips and the fact that he is obviously perfectly spherical, that's certainly the impression it gives off. You know what, if I look at a move like forward tilt, though, I think there may actually be at least some amount of sliding of the joints. In any case, it's the effect it gives off. And because Pac-Man's body is leaning down and his hips are or look like they're sliding around a bit, The attack actually gets stubby. I talked about body breaking with a character like DK where they compensate for his small legs by literally making it grow during the attack. That's a very common technique in Smash and other games in general. Pac-Man gets the opposite treatment. His feet don't really appear to get bigger. If they do, it's a very small amount. And because part of his silhouette is being covered up by his body, his legs actually look pretty stubby while he's attacking. That's not ideal. It's just following the rules of real world physics, right? If you've got a shorter object and a longer object and they're both being moved to the same positions in the same amount of time, the longer object is going to have more energy packed into it. This one does feel a lot better on contact, and I like the sound design, which is a bit weird to say because it's not that heavy sounding, but it does really fit Pac-Man. And on whiff, I still like the sound design. Is kind of implying that waka waka classic Pac-Man sound. But as far as the on-whiff visuals go, I think it looks a bit weak. And for the landing, does he do the same kind of bailout that Peach and Daisy do? No, actually maintains better control. I think it does fit though. The way he gets up is pretty well balanced, but he never really bails out that much to begin with, so that's fine. At the end of the day, I think it's another B tier though. What about Lucas? A very different kind of flurry kick. You know, I guess at the end of the day, it's not really that different a concept. The main thing is the particle effect, and also he's facing directly towards the camera this time around. The silhouette actually works better for me. His arms do whip around a bit too much. It feels like natural body mechanics, but it also breaks the edge of his silhouette up just a bit more than I necessarily want. Very nitpicky though, it's not enough to stop the concept from coming through. It helps that you can really see him tucking his knees in and hyperextending his legs on each of the 4 kicks individually, so even if he didn't have that psychic energy helping him out, this might still be the strongest looking individual flurry kick. But of course he does have the energy, and I think it's well positioned. I've always liked Lucas's particle effects to begin with. It creates some satisfying motion trail-esque things behind him if you do it while he's moving. And for the landing animation, they went with a bit more of a Pac-Man-esque style where he mostly maintains control, maybe slightly out of character for Lucas, at least the way he's portrayed in Super Smash Bros., but overall, I think it does fit into the game well. There is a bit of a harsh transition. He does jump between 2 relatively different poses, and yeah, at some points through the animation, that is a bit noticeable, even at full gameplay scale and speed, but not too bad. And I like the sound design on this one. It's another quadruple hit, which feels good in its own right, and the final hit has a distinctively different sound to it, and that's carried over to the on-hit sound too. I think S tier honestly feels great to use, very well done technically. The X factor is the particle effects. Good stuff. Might as well do Ness while we're at it. This is not a flurry kick, it's a single-footed downward stomp, but kind of an unusual one. He does a spin during it. There's still obviously the particle effect involved, and there's some momentum disruption to it. It's very subtle, but you do definitely feel it. I've always thought this one feels just a little bit disjointed, or disjoint has a different term in Smash. A little incohesive, I guess would be the word I'd use. And looking at it now in slow motion, I think I understand why. The way Ness spins around and lifts his leg up here seems to be implying that he should be using that to drop into the kick. He's using it to build momentum to increase its power. Great in principle, but then at the very end, his leg just kind of snaps straight down and doesn't use that rotational momentum essentially at all. It still sort of gives off the impression it may be a downwards facing roundhouse or crescent kick, but it's kind of hard to tell what he's doing. Even looking at it up close in slow motion, I couldn't 100% sign off on what type of kick it's supposed to be, and at full gameplay scale and speed, it definitely gives off more the impression of just a straightforward downward stomp, which means the spin is kind of unnecessary. If they really wanted to portray the concept that I think they're going for here, which is that downward oriented circular kick, not necessarily a full-on crescent kick or anything, but just some amount of rotational momentum involved, what they could have done is sped the spinning part of the animation up just by a few frames, and that would give them a few frames of leeway to make the final kicking part of the attack have time to travel through an arc of any sort, because that may still be what they're going for, but it's just so fast that there's no ability to convey any sort of rotational momentum in here. It just snaps into position instantly, and then there's no rotational follow through. His leg just snaps straight back up, which may mean I'm wrong about what they're even going for in this case. It may be supposed to be more of a stomp. But in that case, why is his toe pointing straight down? Is the toe supposed to be the part that's contacting? I guess you could make that case, but it really does come across to be more like it's supposed to be the top of his shoe. If you look at the particle effect, that is also on the center of his shoe, not his toe, so that kind of implies that's the sweet spot. So I don't get it. Honestly, I don't even really understand what the particle effect's doing here. Unlike with Lucas, it's not clearly providing an obvious function to the attack. This one's a little muddled. And then the landing animation is also kind of off kilter. At this point in the animation, he does a bit of an awkward snap. The concept does work. He lands on his outstretched foot, and then he needs to lean forward to correct himself. Yeah, I think C tier for this one. It's got some style to it, which I appreciate, but the style's aimed in sort of a weird direction that in some ways does detract from it. And then what I think is our final quadruple flurry kick thing, Snake. The thing that really stands out to me right away on this one is the very distinctive floating effect Snake gets. It's very prominent, and as far as I'm aware, it's totally unmotivated. This isn't a thing from the Metal Gear series. Snake is just a human being. There's no reason for it to be here. It's very out of place. It shouldn't work, but it does work. It's implemented in a way that even though it doesn't make any actual physical sense, it does make video game physical sense. You look at the way he stretches his leg out for that final kick and it's like, yeah, of course he's pushing off the air a little bit on that. Why not? It is balanced out by some realism though. Obviously, this is not a realistic attack whatsoever, but the way that Snake uses his arms and legs in sync with each other like that to maximize the rotation each time he does a particular kick, that is actually pretty solid use of body mechanics. It's similar to a lot of martial arts principles. The concept does risk the silhouette becoming muddled, and during the initial 3 kicks, maybe slightly, although it's still relatively readable. The final pose that he strikes is really strong though, and again, plays very well into that kicking off the air vibe. The landing animation for this one fits Snake well, very solid and straightforward. Again, I wish they would push off with their hands better though. And then nothing fancy on the sound design for this one, but it does feel very powerful and satisfying to land. Which it should, considering it does 20%. I think I'm going to go A tier for this one. For me, Lucas is still the premier user of that attack archetype. There are a few more nitpicks I have with Snakes, but still very good. How about the Samuses? This is kind of a funny concept. It's a swipe with their cannon arm, which in many ways is not too fundamentally different from a swipe with a sword or a dagger, so we've seen something vaguely similar with Joker. The big difference, which is much more readable on this side, is that Samus is turning her body almost entirely horizontal during the swipe, which in principle is a bit of an odd concept, but in practice I would say it actually works pretty well. It really lets her emphasize the arc that the attack follows. If you look at this at full gameplay scale and speed, the impression you get is very much semicircle, and that even applies on this side where her body is obscuring part of it. They were careful to let enough of the particle effect go through that that's still very much the vibe you get. And the fact that her entire body is rotating along the Z-axis means that she can actually get a decent amount of torque into it, which implies a decent amount of power. It could certainly look more powerful if she was allowed to wind up more and then overextend a bit more in the end, so more overall rotation, but that would take away from the semicircle. As is, the way this attack functions is very intuitively clear just from watching one instance of the animation. I also feel like I might actually be underselling the torque a bit, because if you look at the initial startup of the move, her torso is facing completely towards the sky. So it's really just more the follow through where she winds things down a little bit earlier. Also think of, say, a whip, right? When it's doing the most damage, it is straight. And if you look at the rotation here, this move spikes near the center of it. And what do we see? We see a hyperextended elbow. And then that carries on for a few more frames. And it's around this point when the move is cooling down, she actually finally starts to gain more control back of her arm. So nice kinetics. Pretty well defined landing pose on this one, although it really does depend on how far through the arc you are. There, it's pretty much perfect, although I really wish she was pushing off the cannon. But if you cut the attack off too early, there is a fairly jarring snap. Although the particle effect, even then, the smear covers it up decently well. From this side though, yeah, it's a bit of a mess. And then sometimes we do get nice fancy animation deviations from Dark Samus. This time around, absolutely nothing. It's identical. We don't even get that cannon opening up. Samus and Dark Samus for some moves utilize the cannon in different ways, and it's always got some nice animation work done on it. This time around, there's nothing for either of them. Does this fit Dark Samus? It's not the worst. It absolutely does feel more at home on Samus though, and that landing animation just doesn't seem right on it. It's too heavy and too heroic a pose for a floating phase-on monster that wants to take over the universe. I guess the lack of pushing off the cannon makes more sense here. Samus B tier, fine but unremarkable. Dark Samus, yeah, I'll just give it B tier too. Sometimes I do make them pay the clone tax, especially Dark Samus, where animation differences are supposed to be what justifies its existence, but I don't feel like doing that here. It's fine. I've danced around it a couple of times. Let's do an actual sword swipe. For Marth and Lucina, yeah, they're using actual long swords now, but overall, the premise is actually pretty similar to the Samuses. They're completely aligned along the Z-axis. Their torsos still do face the sky, but it's a lot less dramatic. They don't get to rotate nearly as much or linger in that pose as long, so the implied rotational momentum is less in that sense, but they are swinging big swords, so they naturally generate a lot more force just by virtue of being long and covering about the same space in the same amount of time. One leg stays tucked in, the other one's allowed to move out with the sword blade a bit. I like that. And they have capes, and while I don't love this initial stiff dangle at the very start, I do love the way it's allowed to flow around them as the attack winds down. At full gameplay scale and speed, I'm not going to say that initial dangle is entirely irrelevant, but it's really not that bad. I do have a functionality problem with this one though. It spikes for 1 frame directly underneath them, and that applies whether you're using Marth or Lucina. The tipper mechanic doesn't even come into play. And then after that, depending on exactly where in the trajectory you hit them, there are a couple of different positions they can be sent in. And this attack concept doesn't really imply that all that well to me. It's not how a lot of these spiking arcs work, but there's no real visual distinction from the other ones. For their landing animation, the actual landing itself is pretty well done. On the way up, again, I wish there was more of a push off and a bit of unfortunate clipping on the sword blade. I pretty much always prefer Marth's attacks over Lucina's because he's got the more interesting particle effects to designate that tipper mechanic, and there's a fun reward for connecting the sweet spot. But the sour spot still sounds pretty good. Lucina does not get that luxury. She has 1 setting. Other than that, and the different particle effects, it's the same thing. I do like that elegant flowing vibe. It feels very fitting on them, but they're nothing remarkable, and the functionality conveyed does have some minor issues with it. Lucina B tier. Marth, I really do like the particle effect. I do like the extra sound design. That's a boost that all his moves get in my eyes. Sometimes it's enough to push it over the top versus Lucina, but this time around I think not quite, especially because his functionality problems are actually worse, if anything. Seems like a good time to bring in Roy and Chrom. This is a wildly different concept now that Roy's been differentiated from Marth. It's a double-handed downwards chop. It does in some ways have a similar issue with the sweet spot sour spot distinction. This move does have a sweet spot that spikes, and then a sour spot and multiple sour spots actually that don't. And where they are is not particularly clear. It's supposed to be, I think, at the hilt of Roy's sword, which lines up with his overall game mechanics, but you know, that giant flaming blade does not make that especially clear. You just sort of have to know that. The animation's not really helping, especially because the sour spot is also off to the sides of his body. Functionality considerations aside, it is a very strong looking chop. I like the way he winds up and then comes down. Wish there was a bit more attention paid to his cape like there is on Marth and Lucina though. How cool would it be if it flared up behind him instead of doing that thing where it's just kind of draped over one shoulder? Would even make some sense in context. It's like it's being filled up with hot air. From this side, you can see just how far he puts his sword behind him, but other than that high point, the attack is obviously far more obscured. That applies to the landing animation as well. On this side, it is a bit of a blob. Over on this side, that works quite well up until he needs to start transitioning back into idle stance. Good, weird. Yeah, there's some slidiness going on. That's actually pretty bad. It doesn't synergize with his idle stance at all. And while Roy does have other fire moves on his kit, most of them don't use it. And while the ones that don't have incredibly clear sour spot versus sweet spot sound effects, that doesn't apply nearly as much to the flame ones. There is thankfully still a difference though. Still a lot harder to react to overall though. And then Chrom has the same animation as Roy minus any of the flame particle effects, and it's missing something without them. It kind of feels like they were using the flames to help out the arc feeling a little bit. Without them, it looks just slightly stiff. The sword just dangling out there at the end does not look especially impressive. I don't get why you couldn't have gotten the wind particle effects like they swap out some of Roy's other fire moves for. That's not the only move on his kit I've got that question about though. Back to mechanical considerations, Chrom's down air works the exact same as Roy's does, where he's got a sour spot and a sweet spot, but unlike with Roy, Chrom doesn't have any kind of sweet spot, sour spot, hilt mechanic on his other moves. That's the entire premise of the character, but guess what? Here, it works exactly the same. So it was a bit confusing in Roy's case. It's really unintuitive here, and it also introduces the same kind of reaction issue. Those technically sound different from each other, but you're not reacting to them differently. And again, this is not a problem Chrom's moves tend to have because the entire premise of the character is not having to worry about sweet and sour spots. When it comes to Roy, I'm a huge sucker for fire particle effects. That's always done it for me. But it's got some functionality concerns. I really think the cape could have been handled better. Get up animation's not that good. The concept's fine, but the concept also fundamentally introduces lingering hitbox fakeouts, which I didn't really bother covering on these guys too much, but we will get there. I have a very hard time resisting fire, and it's got some other great elements going for it, but B tier's the highest I can go, and honestly, it was kind of close. Chrom's is pretty much worse in every conceivable way. It's getting C tier. Let's do Ike. Okay, so for Ike, it's pretty much the same thing, a chop along the Z-axis. The thing is, this one really implies that it should have some kind of lingering sour spot on it based on the animation, but it doesn't at all. And that's because, surprise, surprise, it used to. When this move was first conceptualized, that's exactly what the developers thought should happen. And here's the thing, other sword moves that use a similar concept in Smash generally still do this. With Ike, on the other hand, they took away the sour spot in future games, but did not change the move concept. So as a result, it feels a bit stranded. When it does connect, it thankfully feels great. I always love that Ragnall sound design, but it really does look like it should have just a bit more leeway than it actually does. And no, I don't really think the sword glow is a good enough marker for a hitbox all by itself. If we look at the move outside of functionality though, this is really good. I like it better than Roy's in basically every way except that Ike doesn't get flames. Man, if all his moves had blue flames, can you imagine? That would mean that moves like Eruption wouldn't have an identity anymore. I guess they'd just have to get rid of it, give him maybe, I don't know, the sword beam from the Radiance games. I'm getting off track here. Yeah, there's such good wind up and follow through on this one. Look at only his legs, ignore everything else. Just those alone are so strong. And then looking at this side, you can see that he doesn't actually pull his sword back nearly as far as Roy does, but it's back far enough. And the thing is, he has both hands on it right from the start. And because he torques the rest of his body more convincingly, and it's a bigger, heavier sword, I still think the overall impression is a more powerful move. And I was talking about a cape flare up. There it is. It's not awkwardly flung over one shoulder. The landing animation is pretty different too. There is some snapping going on. The sword needs to move into a totally different position because it ends up between his legs and is going to clip into the ground a little bit. That's just something you have to deal with. That aside, the way he lands on one knee and one foot feels very appropriate. The way he gets up is a little slidey. I still wish there was heft behind it, but given the overall pose he ends up in is relatively centered, it's not as bad as some examples. And in this case, the cape covering him up, I think actually helps that out a little bit and looks kind of menacing and cool in his own right. I don't think the facing away side is necessarily a detriment like some characters I've looked at. It's a very nice animation. Is it S tier? There's just a bit too much to pick at, I think. Upper A tier for sure though. That's like an A+. And then we might as well take this concept to its extreme. Byleth. This is the single strongest overall spike of any Dan Aaron Ultimate. Does it feel like it? Yeah, I'm gonna say it does. Very satisfying wind up and release on this one, and the screen actually shakes a little bit when you throw it out. That's a great touch. Yep, brings it way back, brings it to its final position quickly, nice strong posing at the end. The one thing I don't love about it is its recovery animation. He just more or less brings it back exactly the way it came, and yes, he does have it under control by the end of the animation, so he doesn't necessarily need to do a smooth circle back into position, but it still feels like it's more natural for him to swing it this way, do the attack, then for his recovery animation, continue afterwards. Should probably also tuck it into his body more as it's coming back. As is, this feels like he's fighting against gravity. And hey, maybe he's just super strong, but even if you're strong, that just makes you better at doing the more efficient movements. This is a very leggy move as you might expect, and the pose he ends up in, he's going to be stuck in for a while, so they should make it very strong and well defined, which they do. And finally, some actual heft, some actual effort when he's getting back up. It took the strongest spike in the entire game to get there, but we got there. It's very obscured on this side, but the silhouette still does read decently well. The way that the axe just snaps back into the sword, which is more noticeable on this side, when you're really scrutinizing it, it does look a little bit strange, although the animation that they did with the handoff is actually pretty well poised to go into it. Viewed as intended, it really doesn't matter all that much. You just kind of accept it. Smash has tons of cheats like that. I think that one's going to get S tier, with the arguable exception of his recovery, which is still not really that bad. It does basically everything right. I covered Ryu and Ken already. Let's do Terry. Very similar concept this time around because, as you might imagine, this is also adapted from his jumping heavy punch in the King of Fighters series. I think I prefer this one a bit though. It's got some really nice wind up to it, and because he's pointing his arm at a slightly higher angle, his leg doesn't cut off the silhouette nearly so much. There's less of a blob effect. The landing animation is not nearly so good though. I like the actual landing pose. It makes a ton of sense, but Ryu and Ken had that very nice two-stage get-up. Terry doesn't really do that. It's pretty typical. It's fine, but not really praiseworthy. And he's another fighting game import, which means we've got more nice fighting game sound effects. Yeah, same tier as Ryu and Ken. Makes sense. Their push into A was that landing animation. His push into A is having a slightly better animation at a base level for me. Seems like a good time to bring in Kazuya. This is a weird one. This is another adaptation from his home series. A very different vibe on this one, though. He just kind of dies. Look at this. He does a pretty smooth flip over, but then he just turns stiff as a board, goes way down, and dies. And he'll do that from quite a height, not infinitely. Like, you can go all the way up to the top, and in that case, he will peel out of it, but just barely. This one feels very strange to use. Kazuya comes from Tekken, a fighting game series with low hit pause, and that is carried over. He actually just straight up has lower hit pause than other Smash characters. People just kind of fly out of his attacks. That tends to make kill moves in particular feel kind of strange. They're missing impact compared to other characters, and this is a surprisingly strong kill move, and I say surprisingly strong because that just doesn't look that committal to me. I mean, in one sense, it is extremely committal. He's hurling himself at you about as much as he possibly can, but I just can't shake the vibe he's lying down. And when you put it all together, yeah, it feels weird. Weird in almost an endearing way, though. I'm struggling with this one. From a technical perspective, it's not very good. Tekken animations often are very stiff. This is no exception, but there's something to it. There's no other move like this in Smash. I gotta commend them for that, and it does have a certain charm to it. This is like a C tier that I like enough to move up to B. Let's look at Bayonetta. This is a more, I guess you'd call it, conventional take on the idea. It's already kind of wild and exaggerated, as is very fitting for Bayonetta moves, but compared to Kazuya, it feels almost tame. Besides the different pose she strikes though, and obviously different particle effects, standard hit stop, all that kind of stuff. The concept behind these two are surprisingly similar to each other. A big flip over into a kick where they just basically hold their body in one continuous position the entire way down. There's almost no motion at all. I don't like that she doesn't accelerate into the kick a little more forcefully though. It looks a bit too relaxed for my liking. Kazuya, again, was very stiff in the same way, but for him you can at least make the argument it's a stylistic choice. With Bayonetta, I don't think you can in the same way. Her moveset's supposed to feel very fluid and smooth. This feels more like an outlier to me. If she had a more defined wind up and then explosion into the final kick before she struck that pose, I think it would be improved. I do really like the landing animation on this one. Great particle effects, the splayed out stance is very Bayonetta, and the way she gets up is slightly slidey, but when viewed as intended, I think it reads just fine. She's putting at least a bit of effort into getting up. I always appreciate that, and it feels like Bayonetta. There is some substance behind this one, and while I do wish the animation itself exploded into the kick more, once she does have air momentum, yeah, that feels pretty good to land. I think that one's gonna get A tier. You know what, the flip momentum isn't that big a deal and it has so much character to it. This one can be S. Cloud is the first sword Pogo we've looked at. It's got a sweet spot that spikes and then a sour spot that pops up. Nice, well-defined silhouette on this one that reads pretty well from both sides. A good forceful thrust downwards on this one too. Some speed lines to indicate at least roughly when the sweet spot is active for. Those do get obscured a lot more on this side, but still visible. No huge, misleading, lingering sour spot issues. That's just inherently not as big an issue for this type of move compared to a faster thrust downwards. That's not to say there isn't a window when he's holding the sword out and it's not active anymore, but it's really not for very long. And while I criticized someone like Ike's sword glow being used as a crutch for when the hitbox was active, for Cloud, you know, I'm not necessarily going to say he's 100% exempt from that, but there's such a striking juxtaposition in this case between big, stinking, glowing green thing and then dull gray, flipping a switch between it's radioactive, run, and then absolutely nothing. When you stack that onto it being so much less of an issue to begin with, I think it gets a pass. I like his landing animation when he pulls the sword out of the ground too. There's a nice sort of snappiness to it. Reads very well at full speed, whatever side you're doing it from. I generally like how he hits the ground, how his body reacts, how his sword digs into it. The one exception is his feet though. If you look at the stance he's striking, it's pretty wide, but then his feet almost snap in a bit. You could argue it's because his sword point is hitting first and he's kind of suspended in the air on it, right? Which would make sense. Think of like a pogo stick hitting the ground before your feet do. They would swing inwards a little bit. But in practice, it doesn't really pan out that way. His sword doesn't react to contacting the ground instantly. It reacts to it at foot height. When his feet contact the ground more so than the sword point, that's when he actually reacts to it. So yeah, the end result does look slightly wonky. If there were even a couple of frames where he decelerated, so the tip of the sword encounters resistance just a bit faster and his legs start to swing in, it'd be fine. It is nitpicky, yes, but A, what are you here for? And B, this is actually something that you notice at full gameplay scale. There is just a bit of weird snappiness in his legs. Oh, and I forgot to talk about the sound design. So Cloud has custom retro-inspired sound effects. How much you get out of them is a personal thing. For me, they've always seemed just a bit swishy and insubstantial. I think that actually works pretty well for sour spot specifically, though. I'm feeling a solid A tier on that one. I guess while I'm bringing up Sword Pogos, might as well do the original Sword Pogo here, and then Young Link has pretty much the same thing. Toon Link adds in the ballpark. While I'm here, why not? Link's feels quite similar to Cloud's in a lot of ways. I think I prefer the feel of it a bit more overall, though. The thinner blade makes it feel more focused. Obviously, if you're doing a piercing attack, you want as thin a point as possible, and he tucks in a bit more, and it helps that he falls so fast. That does help sell a move like this. In Link's case, that already relatively inconsequential lingering sour spot concern is essentially completely removed because the second the sword stops glowing is the second he starts retracting it. This one has a sweet spot that spikes. And of course the expected lingering sour spot. And you'll notice that Link bounces off his opponent with this one. It's a nice touch, makes the attack feel really fun to use. Would have been nicer still if Link reacted even slightly if he gets the bounce. You can see his body does absolutely nothing. He just stays in the same pose. This is directly taken from the downward thrust in Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, where he does the same thing. That was an 8-bit game though, so you think they could have maybe modernized it a bit. They can do more than move a couple of pixels around. I think it's a testament to the overall very strong posing though, that it does work regardless. It doesn't feel too strange or out of place. I don't really get what's going on with his back foot in the landing animation though, because the thing is, this is basically a landing pose already. If I told you this was the landing frame right here with the sword just embedded in the ground, would you have any reason to doubt me? It actually looks very natural. But then the second he actually does contact the ground, it's a bit hard to see in the particle effects, but why is his foot suddenly in a different spot? It looks like he should be landing on his front foot and then his back knee. It's a very efficient use of the animation actually, but then the second he goes to land, his knee's tucked up. And at full speed, the entire thing looks a little bit busy overall too. This is another multi-stage animation, which I do appreciate. He pulls his sword out of the ground and then he reaches behind him for his shield and then he brings that over his back, and that's actually pretty smooth, and the entire thing works very well conceptually, and in slow motion where you can actually take a beat to see everything that's going on. I think it reads totally fine. When viewed at full speed and scale, the arc the shield takes is still really good. The sword arc is okay in isolation, but it feels slightly jumpy. Link's just doing slightly too much in not enough frames, and because that arc overlaps with the shield while it's happening, it makes the entire thing look a bit jumpy. Happens on this side too. Obscuring some of the detail, it becomes more obvious that the sword animation is a little cramped feeling. That could have just been slightly smoother. This is absolutely a nitpick, but it's noticeable. Young Link has a very similar concept to it, but unlike in Melee where it was just a straight up carbon copy of Link's, here it's got much more jauntiness to it. I like that decision. This isn't quite directly lifted out of a Zelda game in the same way, but it does feel far more fitting for this incarnation of Link. He's much more agile and acrobatic than you might expect. And interesting detail, because Young Link is still left-handed, unlike Breath of the Wild Link, all of his back-facing, front-facing animations are reversed. Love the expression he gets on his face during this one, very determined, but also still kind of childish, and I also really like the smugness during the landing animation. That landing animation is pretty good overall. Hits the ground in a heroic stance, and because he has both his feet out, he actually unambiguously lands on both feet. There's none of that jumpiness that adult Link deals with. His top hand is on the pommel helping out, but then once he hits the ground, it slips off a little bit. Maybe that speaks to his slightly less experienced nature. I'm not sure that's what they were going for, but it does seem fitting. This is still kind of a multi-stage attack where he pulls his sword out of the ground first, but they kept it less busy overall, which I think works better for him. I think it could have still felt a bit smoother on the sword if there was more of a circular flourish back to idle, but this works. I don't have any major complaints. Still no reaction to bouncing on an opponent's head. Now, in many ways, I think the animation is better set up for it than Adult Link. His legs are already kind of in a bouncing off position, but because they're more spread out overall, the fact that there's no flex or recoil action whatsoever does feel slightly unnatural. That's more in theory though. In practice, you know what? I really don't find myself minding. This one has no spike on it. It always sends up, and this animation doesn't really look like it should always be popping up, if I'm honest. With sour spots, you can look past it a lot more easily. Smash just doesn't really have spiking sour spots for the most part, but for a sweet spot, yeah, that really looks like it should be a spike anyways. In Melee it was, but the livelier, springier animation does kind of impart the concept of bouncing up, so this gets away with it at least more than some attacks would. And then Toon Link, you can see where they're coming from, but this one actually has very different inspiration behind it. This is almost a Sephiroth light thing they're doing. It is directly taken out of the Wind Waker. There is a nice forceful plunge downwards on this one, but the landing animation is my favorite part of the entire thing. Look at that. That's got more personality than basically anything I've looked at today. Once he does get the sword pulled back out of the ground, yeah, it's another move where he probably could have controlled the momentum with more circular, smooth actions. It would have made the entire animation feel a bit more cohesive, because once I start doing it like this, it does look honestly kind of amateur. There is a very defined snappiness to it, but I love the personality behind it so much that I'm willing to overlook a lot. Not the sound design though, I still hate that. For some reason, the Smash team decided that Toon Link in particular needed his own custom-engineered set of hit sounds. They don't come from a Zelda game, and they tear my eardrums up every time. They're so harsh. Three relatively similar moves that have surprisingly different considerations between them. Link, I think, is going to get S tier. Not only is it a fantastic reference, one of the strongest references of any Danner in the series, there's not really much I dislike about it, except for a tiny bit of busyness in the final part of the recovery animation, which, okay. And then it would be nice if there was some slight reaction when he bounced on an opponent, but it really doesn't bother me in practice, and you could make the argument it's more accurate that he doesn't. Young Link, I think I'm going to go A tier, because while I do probably prefer this one over Adult Link in a vacuum, even though it's a less direct reference, the fact that the animation doesn't fully convey exactly what the attack does is a problem. If they gave it a spiking sweet spot back, that would probably bump it up into S tier, and you could go, wait, hold on a sec, that's a change to the functionality of the move, and this is an animation tier list, but communicating functionality for a move is part of the animation's job, so if the functionality changes and the animation doesn't change to reflect that, that's a knock against it. For Toon Link, I hate how it sounds, and the second part of the recovery animation is probably the worst of all of them, but the first part is so good. It is a very cool reference if you know about it, but if you don't, it's not a particularly standout attack. That'll join young Link in A tier. What about Mii Sword Fighter, a character who's indirectly ripping off Link, so I guess that would be a good time to bring all the Miis into play. Yeah, Mii Sword Fighter's Danner is clearly intended to be a take on Link's, but that multi-hit drill aspect does give it its own flair. A surprising amount of flair for a character who's supposed to be, in theory, very generic. There's some nice build-up on this one. Subtle touch, he puts the sword into a reverse grip before starting, and then he holds his arm up quite high and then swings it diagonally downwards, and considering this is a downward thrusting attack that imparts rotational momentum, yeah, that's the correct orientation. I think the way that he imparts that momentum does look pretty natural. It's a smooth-looking spin. They opted not to have the sword point perfectly on axis, which they certainly could have done. If they wanted to, he certainly could have traced a perfect cone, but I think it's fine that they didn't. It actually makes the attack feel a bit more naturalistic. It's slightly less piercing, which would be the argument in favor of it. The landing could have a bit more done to it. I'm not worried about the fact that at certain orientations he's going to have to do a big snap back into position. It's a spinning attack, that's just how that works. You don't really tend to notice it at full gameplay scale and speed, but he's spinning very fast, and while the sword may stop the second it plunges into the ground, he should keep going. There should be a skid out here. That could actually give it some really cool style. He keeps spinning and he uses the crossguard or something to sort of anchor himself. Crossguard is probably too ambitious because the Miis can swap out what the sword looks like, but the handle even, just a little bit of friction. As is, when he hits the ground, it does look slightly jarring as momentum stops just a bit too quickly, but when he's pulling the sword out, I gotta say, that's smoother than any of the Links. That's that nice, gentle arc that I was looking for. Mii Brawler has a similar concept to Diddy, that double hammer fist strike. I think this one works a lot better though. And it's because he doesn't fall into the same issue as Diddy. This is quite a nicely defined silhouette. Really good wind up on it too. Look at how spring-like his back arch looks. And then when he lands, it looks even a bit less controlled than Diddy's does. And that makes sense because he's really hurling himself into it. On this one though, the lack of heave up on his arms, it really gets to me. His center of gravity clearly is in a position where he should have to push off. I absolutely have been getting pedantic with some of these characters, and you can make an argument that they weren't all in stances that necessarily needed help from their arms to get back up. It just would have been a nice bit of polish. This time around though, no, look, he's completely hunched over, his legs are spread way out to the side. He should need his hands to help snap back into position so quickly. I've also got to say, while it really looks like the powerful spike it is, it doesn't particularly sound like it. It does get a proper spike sound effect against airborne opponents, which helps. But it's not a weak move on the ground either. I don't know why it's stuck with such an anemic sound effect. And then we get to Mii Gunner, who you might expect to steal from Samus like she does with a lot of her other moves, but this is actually more of that Z-axis chop concept that obviously also puts the cannon arm to use, which is very thematically appropriate. This is the most pew-pew happy character in the entire game, and I mean, yeah, what's her name again? There's some great recoil action on the cannon during the explosion, and she does a similar splayed leg stance to Brawler. Does keep one leg tucked in a bit more though, so it's not as clearly defined a silhouette, at least not right away, and I will say the explosion cuts into it a bit. I'd say it's relatively successful overall though. The thing is, by the time the smoke clears, the pose has gotten into a pretty strong point. Oh, I don't know whether I love or hate this. The landing animation is extremely similar to Samus, but she pushes off with the cannon. It's not the heaviest push off in the entire world, but yeah, it's very noticeable. Why can't Samus do that? This one does have a sweet spot sour spot system, and they sound pretty different from each other. And I do generally like that heavy fire sound. For Mii Sword Fighter, I'm going A tier. It's a fun concept that's implemented pretty well. I think it does stack up against the Links. Really does put his own spin on, on an existing concept. Mii Brawler's also getting A tier. No original concepts here, but this is Diddy's done right. Given he's supposed to be the most generic brawling character in the game, it's kind of odd he didn't get a stomp. That's the move that I would intuitively think belongs there. But the hammer fists do feel in character, or at least whatever semblance of character you can dig up. And then Gunner, I was not expecting to do this, but I have no complaints. It's a great animation, what can I say? The concept even stands on its own merits. What about Bowser? I'm happy I can take a closer look at this one because hopefully it'll let me answer the question, why don't I like this as much as I want to? It's something I've been thinking for a while. Okay, so first off, I think the way he builds momentum up is not really that great. He flips onto his back, but there's not really an impression that he's winding up while he's doing it. You know, he's not turning his arms this way so he can fling them that way to get rotational momentum going. The fact that he starts spinning at all actually seems kind of unmotivated. He just begins, and the little float he does at the top while this is happening is relatively standard for stall and falls. That's what they're named after, but in Bowser's case in particular, it really robs it of a sense of weight, and so to shrinking himself, it obviously makes it look like nowhere near as much weight is plummeting downwards anymore, and Yeah, I don't think his up special on the ground or up special in the air are actually any physically smaller than his down air is. I'm fairly confident in saying there's no different amounts of body breaking going on between the different attacks, but it almost feels like it. This one, who cares if there's less to plummet at you, he's already on the ground. This one, they actually go out of their way to make the shell bigger. That's a change they made compared to Smash 4, which had a completely different animation. It's not actually getting bigger, but the perspective they use kind of implies that it takes up more space on the screen, whereas this just does not feel as intimidating as this, where Bowser stays out of his shell the entire time. I do have object permanence. I know there's actually, strictly speaking, the same amount of mass in there, even if he tucks himself into his shell, but it doesn't feel like it. It's an implication thing, especially because the way that Bowser actually tucks himself into his shell is not physically possible. What the animators are actually doing is just scaling his limbs down, so in a very literal sense, he is getting smaller. Another reason the Bowser Bomb feels intimidating is because it moves fast. Down air doesn't. It starts off floaty at the top and it stays feeling a little bit floaty the entire way down. And despite being a drill, it's only a single hit. This could be a very nasty feeling move that really grinds into his opponent. That's how it used to work. This wasn't always a diving attack, and in the older Smash games, I would say it actually felt much more satisfying to land, even though he's moving slower. The concept behind him tucking in and diving at you shell first is actually pretty fun, but there are so many little things they could have done to make it feel better to use. One thing I do really like about it though is the get up animation. He wiggles around in his shell, struggles, and then pops back into position. It's got some fun personality and does kind of mimic how Mario enemies recover. The entire thing feels slightly rushed, which in some ways is unavoidable when you've got to make an animation last so few frames and do so much. But still, they could have had him dig into the ground and use his shell a bit more like a spring. As is, the wiggle just kind of abruptly ends and his limbs pop out. It's a cool animation though, I don't want to take that away from it. When I look at everything the animation brings to the table though and how good it feels to use or not so good to use, C tier. Like I said, I want to like it much more than I actually do. How about Bowser Jr. with his actual drill? See, this one feels a lot meaner, and not only because there's a very mean clown face on screen, but because it actually digs into people properly. There's some nice detail on this one. Bowser Jr. looking down almost like a bystander going, yeah, get him, and then the way the flap opens up and you can still see the propeller just dangling and even spinning a bit on the back. When he touches the ground, the drill doesn't instantly stop drilling. There's a bit of a sense of it getting embedded into the earth before it has to wind down. Bowser Jr. actually suffers some impact. You can see him do a bit of a bounce and then he shakes his head. This is solid work and I really like the concept. It's a great way to make use of Bowser Jr.'s bag of tricks clown cart. I think I'm going S tier. I rolled Ridley on random characters, so we might as well get this thing out of the way. I do not particularly care for this one. I criticized Bowser's plunge for feeling too floaty and weightless at the top. This has almost the opposite problem for me. There's not really any motivation behind him falling at all here. He just seems to drop out of the air. If, you know, old school cartoon gags, it almost reminds me of when a character's running in midair and then looks down and realizes that and then they just plunge. I really don't get why he doesn't do a downwards wing flap to give himself that boost. That would actually change this animation completely. It would make it feel so much more motivated, so much more powerful. Because as is, even though this is a big character plunging very fast and it's a kill move, it feels surprisingly weak. It's one of those attacks where you land it and you're like, oh, yeah, that's right, I guess this is strong, isn't it? It's got the issue that some of these other stall and falls I've looked at have too, where he actually does do some decent chambering before the attack, so he does coil himself up beforehand, and then when he launches into it, his arms snap up and his feet snap down, but they just kind of freeze in place. They go directly into his long-lasting plunge and just stop, so his feet don't overextend and then snap back into that static position, which would make it feel way more natural and feel like he's putting more effort into it. Still nowhere near as much effort as he'd give off if he actually used the wings, but you know, it would be a start, it would be something. The one thing I do unambiguously like about this one is the landing animation. He hits the ground very hard in a way that makes sense, lands on 3 sets of claws, one of them is still coiled and ready to strike, and the way he gets up even has a bit of a push-off with it. I like that. Don't like it enough to save him from F tier though. Doesn't help that while Ridley does do some stomping in the Metroid series, he's so much more associated with that tail pogo. That's one of his signature moves. It's what every fan implementation gives him, it's what everyone was expecting to have, and it's more interesting. Villager and Isabelle. They both got this downwards turn-up swing concept. It's somewhat reminiscent of Roy's, except more turned on a 45-degree angle, and Villager's is randomized. He uses between 1 to 3 turn-ups. Isabelle always hits 2. There's some nice functionality on that. The more turn-ups Villager pulls, the stronger the attack is, and then Isabelle always having 2 communicates that it's going to be somewhere in between every time. He holds and swings it decently well for his body shape, but he does unfortunately have very stubby arms and a very big head, so there's only so much he can do. It does eat into the sense of power that comes with the move, and this is a decently strong spike. Yeah, that could definitely be a bit better. And then the landing animation, the turn-ups just go away. and he gets up without any kind of effort whatsoever, even though, again, he's in one of these stances where he clearly should be pushing off. And here's Isabelle with her 2 turnip system, and because she's got more or less the same proportions as villagers, she's got very similar pros and cons. Yep, again, whips them down with a decent amount of force, but is restricted on how much she can wind them up. And the landing animation on this one is actually a little different. She more bounces off the ground. I like that more. Wait, does she smack her forehead on the ground? Yeah, she absolutely does, and then she kind of just bonks back into position. That was a little more aggressive than I was expecting. You obviously can't make out too much of her facial expression, but from what you can see, she doesn't seem overly disturbed by that either. I feel like there could have been more of a shocked or panicked expression when she was actually getting up. Not necessarily getting up the entire time, but just the couple of frames after the bonk when you can see her face for the first time. Having turnips just tacked onto their down air of all things does feel a bit strange. I'm not really sure why they're being weaponized in the first place. It does, I guess, tie into a spike being made more or less powerful, which is a relatively dramatic attack for that kind of payoff. But I think they seem better suited to a special move or a passive mechanic of some kind. Danner seems a bit arbitrary. The variation is fun though, I'll give Villager B. Isabelle's are less fun, but in conjunction with Villager, the functionality communicated is still quite good. Duck Hunt. So we've got this multi-hit thing going on here with the dog and the duck each attacking separately. It's a very strong arc on the move, I do like that. It can read as kind of messy when viewed as intended though. The dog is actually doing a headbutt here and then the duck swoops down. I can still absolutely tell what the duck's doing all the time, but at full gameplay scale and speed, I don't think I could have necessarily told you it was a headbutt. It's just too fast and the duck really distracts from it. You can still pretty much tell where the hitboxes are going to be for the most part. That spark underneath the duck, which is generally just more used to indicate where an attack is starting up. In this particular case, also kind of designates where the danger zone is going to be. Accidental, possibly, because the thing is, if you're moving sideways, that doesn't happen anymore. But I'll take what I can get on this one. I like the fact that even though the duck is doing a full 360 spin around the dog, it's pretty clear where the hitbox activity is. With only a couple small changes, this is an attack that you can mix up with a neutral air fairly easily, but the way the duck moves and the good application of the speed lines really does help. The landing animation on this one is appropriately very cartoony. The dog just absolutely flattens into the ground. I like that. Yeah, the duck just has to snap onto his back wherever they are in the spin. That's just the nature of the beast. Doesn't really bother me, and the main thing you're looking at in this instance is the dog. I like the fact that the duck gets out of his way. It's very rubbery and slapstick, which I appreciate on a character like this, and the way he gets up, it's almost like he's stuck to the ground. I think I gotta lop it off at B tier though, because while there is plenty I like about it, the core of the attack is a bit muddy. Pyra and Mithra. Pyra's is interesting to me because the way she swings the sword isn't actually that fast. It feels almost a bit relaxed, which should really detract from the power level, but I don't think it does. This still feels like a decently strong action. Incredibly smooth, fluid arc throughout the entire thing this time around too. Yeah, she points her torso towards the sky like some other moves we've looked at in this vein, but even overcranked a bit more than that, and then does a really huge follow through. She pauses for a moment at the end to let a finisher pose sink in, but then she just continues that momentum onwards. Has some cool flame particle effects on this one, and I like the simple but effective sword animation. It opens up to let the torrent of flame come out. Nothing unique to this particular attack, of course, but it's a little detail I've always appreciated. They could absolutely have gotten away with not doing that, but decided to rig it up anyways. And the landing animation feels appropriate, at least later in the rotation, as she lands on both feet and one hand. Still not much of a push-up. Mithra shows the same framework for this one as they do for all their normals and aerials. I think I prefer Pyra's a bit more because the sort of, I guess, swatting feeling it gives off is a bit more distinct. This is a more typical feeling sword arc. That's not to say it's bad. It of course still has fantastic rotational momentum as she torques her shoulders and torso back to prepare for the swing, but the fact that it lingers on it for a few less frames than Pyra's does means it is a bit harder to appreciate. Same landing animation as well, and for these two I think the backwards facing getup is well handled. Pyra uses generic heavy fire, also punctuated by the spike sound effect, which you're going to be hearing a lot because most of this sword arc does spike. I always wonder how they decide which sound effect gets paired with which move because they're not always the same. I don't know if I'd say this one sounds particularly more down area-ish. Not like either of them wouldn't fit, it's just interesting to think about. And then on contact, it does have generic blade sounds. If they'd been willing to spring for more unique on-hit sounds too to convey more of that laser sword thing, I certainly would have appreciated it, but I can't really ask for much more. This is fine. Pyra, I'm super on board with this one, S tier. For Mithra, this is interesting. I do like Pyra's more. I think it plays to the strengths of the concept more, although it's not really that standout. For some of their moves, there is clearly one character it feels better suited for. I wouldn't necessarily say that for down air. Yeah, it's still very good technical execution. I'll give it to it. Let's do Shulk. Interesting concept on this one, and a very different concept. Shulk is working with something decidedly more lightsabery than Pyra or Mithra, and I like this notion of starting up the laser just being the attack itself. Modern Star Wars has started doing this more and more often, treating it almost like a short-ranged gun. There is some pretty good recoil on this one. When the blade activates, his entire body reacts pretty convincingly. The way he takes the Monado off his back and gets ready to activate it feels a little jarring. It comes off his back a bit quickly, and there's not really much overshoot in his legs in particular when he first goes into that "I'm ready to activate the beam" position. Exactly what he's doing with the Monado is a bit more clear from this perspective, and I think it just stays pointing more or less straight down for a bit too long. And then when it finally does stop facing down, he lifts it up for a brief instant, almost like he's going to go into that Sephiroth raising it above his head with both hands thing. Abruptly cancels out of that idea, just brings it right back down again in a way that terminates, again, a bit quickly without too much overshoot. The landing animation makes sense for the most part. I like the way he hits the ground. It makes sense for after his legs separate in the recoil. Before that, they do need to snap a little bit, but even then it's not that bad. I like the way he gets up and the little handoff he does with the Monado. That's some nice technical work by the animators. Where it falls apart for me is just that last couple of frames when he's putting the Monado onto his back. It's a bit sudden. Ignore, again, the interpolation stuff with it jumping around. You're only seeing that because it's at quarter speed, and at quarter speed, the way he puts it onto his back isn't too rough, although there is still a noticeable rushed quality to it, and when viewed as intended, that gets a lot worse. This actually looks pretty sloppy. He's doing so good for so long, and then just right at that last moment, he fumbles it. He's once again working with some lightsaber sounds. And I'll give it up, this one sounds really nice on contact, especially if you get both hits, the physical hit and then the laser beam. Altogether, I'm going to say A tier. How about another dive kick? Simon and Richter. I'll just look at Simon for this one because these are truly identical in every way, and both of them can canonically learn this, so it doesn't really matter which one I use. This one does have a noticeably stiff quality to it, but in this particular case, that's very clearly intentional. Castlevania just works that way. Even taking that into account, I don't necessarily love the wind-up. It's not that strong looking, and he just literally freezes in place completely once he reaches the pose. There is some nice acceleration into it, though, and the pose after he starts going down is really well defined. I really like the landing animation on this one too. It's got a very defined skid that carries that momentum forward incredibly naturally. I think the pacing is pretty much perfect. Hits the ground hard and spreads his arms out and leans over a lot to maintain control. When he gets up, he doesn't need to be pushing off on this one, obviously. It still does look a bit too effortless for my liking. I still feel like after this rotation he does here, that back knee could push him up into position a bit more. Instead, he just kind of transitions back following the path of least resistance. On this side, where his calf is covering up his knee for a lot of it, you can almost pretend he's doing that, so I think it looks slightly better. This one has a spiking sweet spot, but in either case, the Belmonts bounce off of their opponent, and I think that looks fantastic. It still has some stiffness and heftiness to it. They don't feel like they're ninjas, but that momentum conservation is, once again, very natural feeling. I really like the pose basically the entire way through. Yeah, look at this, some fantastic rotational momentum, and he manages to look strong even when he's upside down. It's good stuff. I think I'm willing to do S tier for these. They're about as good as I can possibly imagine a dive kick getting. Let's use, say, Chic as kind of a middle ground. I say middle ground because this has no elements that totally ruin it, like Zero Suit Samus's bizarre rocket heel contradictions, but there's also no bounce off or any kind of X factor that the Belmonts bring to the table. It's also very much not a canon move. Chic and Ocarina of Time stands in place and teleports. That's about it. I really like a lot of what they're going for here. The chamber animation is really exaggerated. She tucks her knee in so far before she shoots out into a kick. It's a little desynced though. If she started zooming downwards exactly as her kick was coming out, as if her foot just had so much momentum that it was dragging the rest of her body behind it, this would feel stronger. I think that's probably what they're going for anyways, but at full gameplay scale and speed, even when the gap between the kick ending and the zoom starting is much less pronounced, it matters. It makes her descent feel just slightly less motivated than it could have otherwise, and that impacts the sense of power and speed. That's not to say they're bad, and when she actually really gets moving, I love how fast she goes, and it's one of the more satisfying dive kicks to throw out for me, but it could have been better with a relatively small tweak. Interesting landing animation on this one that has a lot of character to it. When she hits the ground, her torso is already facing a bit backwards, so she just leans into that and actually lands upside down, essentially, with her torso facing towards the sky. Is it the incorrect arm catching her, though? Because here's the thing. Her right arm, the one in the background, is already pretty much poised to catch her as is, and she's going to pivot more towards it. But then even in the very first stages of landing, for some reason, it's whipped up, and she's catching herself on her left arm. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm missing something here, but I'm not sure it does. She does twist her arm enough so that her hand is basically in the center of her back like a proper tripod, and if she's that flexible, she could kind of use either arm, I guess. But even then, just think of the way the torque would work on this, right? She landed with this leg first, then this leg, which means this is the direction of her rotation. I'll add it in post, and because she's going to keep rotating that way, it means that the arm that's actually on the ground is going to be essentially ripped off it, as opposed to if she was landing on her other arm, in which case it would be driven further into the ground. So I think I'm right. This is incorrect. It's still a very characterful, stylish landing animation with some nice bounce to it, and she even does a smooth get up afterwards with a bit of a push off, but I gotcha. In reality, I actually still like that landing animation enough that it helps her cause, not hurts it. It's more the desync that I have an issue with, so I think that pushes it down to A tier. And it also just doesn't have the additional high points of the Belmonts, right? It's not a reference, there's no cool bounce off animation afterwards. Zelda, this is a stomp that's enhanced by magic, and it's got some very nice springiness that I do appreciate, but it's also not a particularly strong looking animation, I'm gonna say. Like with Peach and Daisy, the skirt obscures a lot of what she's doing, but unlike with Peach and Daisy, it's not nearly as clear what's going on. I wasn't actually sure if that was a single foot or a double foot until I looked at it right now. It's also got a fairly prominent sour spot on it, and the particle effects do somewhat help contribute to that, but it's still a little unclear. Here's the sour spot, and here's the sweet spot. And if you told me it only had that component to it, I'd believe you. The enormous discrepancy in sound effect between that little thud and then the huge enhanced magical sparkle sound do at least make it easy to react to. And the sour spot existence isn't an enormous issue. You can kind of tell what's going on, but I think that language could have been a bit stronger. She actually is kicking out with her leg quite a bit, except some of that springiness is hidden behind the dress, and then that's not necessarily the end of the world. You can still tell it's there, but her arms, those don't really do all that much. We've looked at characters like Falcon and K. Rool, Charizard and DK for the single-footed stomps, and these are all characters that just bring more to the table in terms of the pose they go into and the high-intensity chamber animations. This feels a bit lackluster in comparison. Yes, those characters don't have magic enhancing their attacks, but I think that's a pretty poor shield. The best-looking magical melee attacks in Smash either still put a lot of effort into the physical aspect, or put no effort whatsoever into the physical aspect and just purely rely on the magic. So it's very obvious the character doesn't actually need to lift a finger. Zelda tends to lean towards the former. She's got a lot of physical energy in many of her moves, and for the most part, it's very successful. Compared to some of those, I don't think this is awful, but I wouldn't call it a high point for her by any means. For her landing animation, she doesn't even really need to change her posing all that much. It makes sense, it feels natural, I like what they're doing here, the way she gets up is pretty good. It's certainly nothing fancy, but it's a good, efficient use of what they were working with, and the end result is hard to complain about. I think I'm gonna go B tier. The concept is fine, but not particularly impressive. The execution is fine, but not particularly impressive. This is right in the middle of the pack for me, which I guess in the end might end up making her more of a B minus, C plus kind of character. These tier lists tend to end up kind of top heavy. That's what happens when you've got some of the best animators in the business working on the game, but I think just plopping her in B is fine. Wario. This corkscrew dive is a new addition for Ultimate. The corkscrew isn't. He just used to not use his hands and throw himself at you head first. I liked that one. It was very distinctive and weird, which was fitting for Wario. I like this one too, though. It's still distinctive and weird, Wario drilling into his opponent with his body, and it also kind of invokes that diving into a pile of gold coins thing, which is also suitable for Wario. I like the little hand clap he does. That's a nice bit of attention to detail. This move does have a problem with unmotivated rotational momentum, though. He just simply starts spinning here. There's no wind up of any kind. He doesn't bring his shoulders back. He doesn't twist his hips back. In Brawl, this made a lot more sense. He intentionally had very jerky, choppy animations. That was a stylistic choice. But by the time we get to Ultimate, they've pretty much just completely abandoned that concept, so to see some semblance of it pop up here, kind of a strange call, weirdly unmotivated and stiff. It would fit alongside Wario's old animation direction fine, but among all these more straightforward moves that he does now, it doesn't really have a home. I think if he did a more conventional wind-up into it, it would look much better and he'd lose nothing. I mean, it's not entirely gone. You see it show up in a couple animations here and there, and even his landing animation in this case has some of that old kookiness to it. This is very funny and I want to like it, but I actually don't particularly. It feels out of date. Now that he uses his hands in the dive, that should have been accounted more for in the animation. This feels designed for the old version. There's a very strange just snap into position here. The way he gets up is odd. I'm willing to call that a stylistic choice, but this portion here when he actually lands simply feels off. I think I'm putting this one in C tier, which might be my biggest surprise of the video so far. I really love the concept behind this one. I think when I did my best of every animation video on MockRock years ago, this might even have gotten honorable mention purely on the back of being really funny, but I really don't feel beholden to those videos at all. I use completely different standards for this series. How about Pikachu and Pichu, a couple characters that never lost that head-first spirit. Some really nice electrical particle effects on this one, I appreciate that. I also appreciate the defined springiness on Pikachu. His entire body deforms a bit when he's going into the hitbox startup. Easier to see what's happening in slow motion. Yeah, some really nice overshooting, and then he bounces back and forth until he settles back into a more natural shape. I like that for the chamber animation, he maintains some amount of horizontal orientation, which gives him more space to wind up, and is a nice wind up. I completely buy him going into that spin afterwards. This has a spiking hitbox on it. And then it's also got a very long-lasting sour spot, and even a pretty well-defined shockwave hitbox. And the way the animation is set up actually conveys each of those elements quite well. Pikachu lands on his head for the landing animation. Again, there's a lot of springiness and body breaking, and he actually uses that springiness to push himself back into idle. I love that. It's similar to Wario's, but I would call it way more successful because Pikachu actually is landing head first, so it makes much more sense. And the spring back up he does from here also makes way more sense and looks much more natural. And then we have Pichu's, which apart from the self-damage aspect is the exact same concept as Pikachu's, but I don't like this one as much. Whereas Pikachu's elasticity was very readable and smooth, Pichu lurches into position a bit. Yeah, look at it in quarter speed. Pichu does two very disparate spring actions in this case. He springs into the chamber and then he springs out of the chamber. I get what they were going for and the theory of it makes sense, but even from this perspective, it comes across as kind of messy and undefined, and at proper gameplay scale and speed, it's much worse. The ears definitely aren't helping. Pikachu tucked his ears back. For Pichu, that does not happen, which makes it almost look like an ear attack. It's got the same landing animation concept as Pikachu, but again, I think Pikachu does it better. The way that Pichu's head slides along the ground there actually looks kind of unnatural. It doesn't really look like that's the way the momentum of the move should naturally be carrying him. It looks almost like he's slipping out from under himself. Pikachu goes all the way up to S tier. I legitimately love that one. Pichu, C tier. I think it's drastically worse. Mr. Game & Watch is always funny to look at on these lists. There are obviously a lot of animation principles that I usually look for that he can't use. I don't hold that against him at all. I more so look at how he plays into his own gimmick and the more traditional principles that he can bring to the table. This is a reference. It's not the single most clever reference on his kit, but it does use his source material fairly well. This is another stall fall that feels kind of surprising to kill with, but in this case, I don't really know what else they could have even done. The windup could maybe be slightly more exaggerated, pulled back a little further, but we're definitely brushing at the edges of what you're able to convey with this 2D sprite concept. He falls decently fast, accelerates quickly, shakes the ground when he lands. I certainly don't think this needed to be a kill move, and from a gameplay balance perspective, you can definitely make an argument that it shouldn't have been, but it is, and as far as making the animation communicate that concept, I feel like this is just about as good as they could do. Similar deal for the landing animation too, right? Like, yeah, the key does snap a bit unnaturally to the side, but they had to have its silhouette still fully visible, so it just had to do that, and there's absolutely nothing else to talk about. It is one single position. I think I'm just gonna go B tier for this one and call it a day. I've really liked some of Game & Watch's moves in the past. This one doesn't make me feel all that much. Pit and Dark Pit. Another example where they're completely identical, so I'll just look at Pit. This is a hefty little sword swipe he's doing here, at least with one sword, the one he's holding in his left hand. For the other one, it's kind of hard to tell what he's doing even at quarter speed. Okay, so strong chamber pose. The sword that's raised more is the one that's going to be doing the big slash. The other one, let's see. He goes into it. That one basically doesn't slash at all. It doesn't slash at all, yeah. His right arm is just being used to build momentum for his left arm, which is the only one attacking. Biomechanically, that's fine, and the ending pose he goes into here is actually very strong and well-defined, looks heroic, and looks like he put a lot of force into it, which he did. But this is a twin sword user, which the roster does not have many examples of. It's a bit funny not to put them both to work. It goes by so quickly that it almost gives off the illusion that's what he's doing, though. Is that a good thing? Maybe, but in that case, why not just use them both? Weird. I don't actually know how much that affects my opinion of it. The landing on this one is simple, but actually pretty effective. I like the way his feet touch down, that makes sense. The way he gets up afterwards. It doesn't need to be that hefty because he maintains pretty good control, and Pit's a floaty character to begin with, so it's okay if he's late on his feet, and it still feels like he's pushing off his back leg a bit. But solid work. I've never loved the swishy, whistly, Kid-Icarus attack sounds. Definitely interferes with how satisfying the attack is to connect. Best you can do is cover it up with a spike. B tier, I guess. They're fine, if not a bit boring, and done in a way that really doesn't take advantage of the character's core concept, and Other than some decent technical execution, I really don't know the argument for pushing them higher. Meta Knight's another downward sword slash. Yeah, this is about as straightforward as you can get. I don't think the windup on this one is particularly good, but it's not like he had a ton of time to do anything else. Particle effect is also not active for very long, but that does actually convey the functionality of the move, which is not active for very long. This does look pretty weak. It's a weak attack. It's not a kill move, but it still looks too weak. Look at this. This is the furthest he ever brings his sword back, and just really, that's the best you can possibly do here. Even if they didn't want to go full-on torso to the sky, which would inherently mean face to the sky as well in this case, 45 degrees, right? That's all I'm asking for. The landing animation is fine. There's a nice bit of recoil and bounce to it, but there could definitely be way more. He could pull a Kirby and pancake a bit, have a bit more squash and stretch in there. C tier, definitely below average. I mentioned Kirby. This may well be the overall most used Dan Air in the entire Smash series, considering how popular Kirby is with the casual fan base and how popular Dan Air is with the casual Kirby players. And you know, I'd say it was done a lot of justice here. I love the elasticity on the windup and the huge amount of body breaking on his feet. They get much bigger, and it's a really strong pose. The one thing I will say is that while I appreciate the way he's tucking his feet in, I think he's tucking them into the wrong side. Looking at the way he tucks up here, this implies to me that he's going to be spinning in a way where his eyes move towards the left side of the screen, but that's the opposite of what happens. He ends up spinning the other way, and to compensate for this, there are just a couple of frames there where his feet need to rapidly move to the other side of his body, and then he can start spinning and throw them out. When viewed as intended, I don't really think it's that noticeable, and the springiness largely takes over and makes it feel good regardless, but it is a small little optimization I think would have improved the feel of the move a bit. And then the landing animation on this one is actually, weirdly enough, a bit lackluster. I love the elasticity again, but why does he end up facing away from the camera? Why does the bounce feel like it's a bit misaligned? Why does he stop so abruptly? This would be a fantastic move to put a skid out animation on, even a very exaggerated one where he spins in place for a full rotation looking a bit worried. Think maybe one rotation of his down smash, that kind of concept. Once again, when viewed as intended, the springiness is the main thing that tends to take over, and it's not a huge deal, but it could have been better. This feels so good to land though. And that goes a long way to forgiveness, especially when the flaws I'm pointing out really are pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Now, placement. This is another drill. We've got multiple drill moves in S tier, but I think all of their executions were better done than Kirby's, and I don't think this deserves it on the back of anything besides Legacy, which I'm not necessarily inclined to do. I think it's a great move. I love having it in the Smash series, but when viewed purely on an animation basis, I think this is more of an A tier. You know, the concept's fun, but it's nothing mind-blowing. The execution is good for the most part, but nothing insane with some nitpicks. Yeah, this is fair. And then we might as well wind down the Kirby gang with King Dedede. This is that Z-axis chop concept again. It's definitely one of the heftiest of any of them. I mean, I say that because it's a giant hammer, but weirdly enough, Dedede actually seems to maintain better control over it than a lot of characters with smaller weapons do. Yeah, that stop is actually a bit on the abrupt side, and you may go, oh, well, Dedede is just that strong, but at the end of the day, animation principles like overshoot are part of what sell the power of the attack. This one doesn't necessarily do it all that well. It just kind of freezes. Not 100%, there's a little bit of vibration in place, and he is holding very close to the head of the hammer, which would keep it more under control. Why does he even necessarily need to be choking up on the hammer so much if his hands were both further down the shaft? That would have him sacrifice some control for power, and whether we're talking about King Dedede's characterization, or we're talking about, again, just relatively straightforward animation principles, I would be happy with that trade. The pose he strikes at the end after the swing is pretty well defined, but even then, the hammer's on a little bit of an angle. If the head of that hammer was a force to be reckoned with, it was huge and heavy and moving fast and dealing a ton of damage, it would pull the shaft straight behind it. It would be trying to escape Dedede. That's a problem. I actually do like the landing animation. There's some nice elasticity in it, and it looks like he's hitting the ground harder than he actually hits his opponent. When he does hit an opponent, it doesn't exactly feel weak, but it's pretty much entirely carried by that sound design. The concept definitely implies it should hit harder than it actually does. I'll let it just slip into B tier, I guess, because big hammer swings are fun, and the way he hits the ground actually brings it up a notch for me, but I feel kind of betrayed. I wish this was higher. It feels like it should be. Another hammer attack on the list, Ice Climbers. The Ice Climbers are never not going to be strange to evaluate, but even by their standards, this is a bit of an oddball move. It's a sword pogo, but it's a sword pogo where the attack doesn't have a point on it, so it doesn't really feel like it should be all that damaging, especially because the Ice Climbers are also relatively floaty characters, and this attack doesn't fall that fast to begin with. But wait, there's a catch, because this time The developers were in on it. This attack is not actually that strong. But wait, there's another catch, because no, it is that strong, but only if the second ice climber makes contact. And you can get both of them to connect into each other, but it's not really that common. It's not a natural combo or anything like that. So for the most part, you're going to get the weaker hit more often, which is fine. And I'd actually say it feels like a far better fit. The ice climbers have other moves on their kit too, which are far more deadly if the second hit connects. That's just an aspect of the character, but in this particular instance, it really does feel like it shouldn't be a kill move. This plunging sound effect also doesn't exactly convey a ton of urgency to the move. The windup on this one is pretty good. He lifts the hammer up quite high. This is another stall and fall that feels like it's missing a bit of spice to it though. If the hammer had even a bit of overshoot before it settled into the plunge position, and that moment of overshoot was when the plunge started, it would feel so much more powerful. The landing animation on this one is pretty great though, I'll give it that. This is a hammer instead of a sword, so rather than sticking into the ground, the ice climber just bounces off. There's a bit of a grimace while it happens. The physics feel pretty natural. The way it goes back into idle afterwards makes sense. It's good stuff. It's another hammer. It's another B tier. How about Jigglypuff? Jigglypuff used to be mostly a knockoff of Kirby, and you can definitely see that DNA coming through in Dan Air. It's got some stuff going for it in its own right too, though. You've got some nice elastic wind-up again, but unlike with Kirby, Jigglypuff is oriented in the correct direction the entire time. While I like the rubbery tuck in and the way she does twist her body back a bit, she could be twisting it more. You can really see the Kirby DNA in this landing animation. It's essentially identical, and Jigglypuff has even more expressive facial features. Take Kirby's criticism, transplant it onto Jigglypuff, and it would likely even be more impactful because Jigglypuff has the better ability to emote. It's a similar deal with Kirby again, where I think at full gameplay scale and speed, these issues aren't too prominent, but there was definitely room to improve. It's kind of funny because the way the moves actually function isn't really similar to each other at all anymore, and I think the concept for this works perfectly fine for both of them. But yeah, this is an animation tier list, and these clearly have a lot more similarities than differences. So I think they belong in the same tier. Little Mac. As with a lot of Little Mac's aerials, this one does look pretty weak, but it's kind of hard to criticize it for that because that's the point. I still don't get why it's not a proper punch though. Little Mac's wrist is bent 90 degrees. It's more of a palm strike, or at least the best palm strike you can muster while wearing boxing gloves. That honestly does seem out of character for him. Yes, he's a boxer. His playstyle is built around being strong on the ground and weak in the air. You ain't no air fighter, Mac, haha. But why would that mean that he's not doing his best to at least try and punch his opponent in the air? This is one of the weakest spikes in the entire game, so the functionality it's conveying is actually appropriate, but that doesn't stop it from feeling a bit odd. I get the flaily nature on his other aerials. They also look weak, but it looks like he's at least trying his best and just can't really make it work without a ground to push off of. Down air, it really doesn't look like he's trying his best, and if this had some kind of pogo action to it, then that would make sense. You know, he's pressing down onto his opponent's head and using them to push himself off, but there's nothing like that. The landing's pretty good on this one though. He hits the ground quite hard and looks almost a bit winded as expected, and then he pushes off his glove when he gets up. Thank you. And it's a pretty strong pose, and the functionality of the move is fairly well conveyed. I guess B tier? It's not like it's an especially exciting concept, and like I said, it feels a bit weird. Banjo-Kazooie. This is another stall and fall with wings involved, and another stall and fall where those wings are not used to flap downwards and accelerate the character. It seems like a wasted opportunity. Kazooie still does look like she's putting at least some effort in to get them going. She does flex her wings. I'm not going to count that as a flap though, not even close. Thrusts her beak forward. I love that, and I love the way Banjo's legs just flail on the way down. Look at him. He's just happy to be here. There's tons of personality packed into this move, like with a lot of Banjo and Kazooie's moves, but I maintain that having her do a proper flap downwards would add so much impact. At least this time around, it is quite a weak move. So, you know, I guess you can make more of a case for it in that sense, but I would still rather have even weak moves feel powerful when they can. The landing animation on this one's pretty great though. Nice, satisfying stick into the ground with some rubberiness, both on the initial impact and then that, I guess you'd call it a bounce up afterwards. That's fun too, and the momentum they go into for the flip isn't the single most natural looking one we've looked at today, but it doesn't look too contrived either. I think it fits. Great facial expressions here too. Kazooie's like, I'm glad that's over with, and Banjo's along for another final little ride on the flip. I love that, but it's still a B tier. The attack at the end of the day just doesn't feel that good to land, and a lot of it is directly the fault of the animation. Robin. So we've got another one of these chop things on a 45-degree angle-ish, and this one is one-handed because he obviously has to hold on to the tome. Good wind up on this one, and I like the way that his cloak flares up behind him. That's a strong silhouette. The way he's actually throwing the attack out looks kind of stiff though. He could definitely have those shoulders rotated more. That would also mean the shoulder of his tome holding arm wouldn't need to be cranked back in such a painful looking way. He really swings his legs into it. I do appreciate that, and from this side, his torso is more or less completely disguised, so he actually kind of gets away with it. But over here, yeah, no, it's pretty obvious. The landing animation on this one makes a lot of sense. He does pop up a bit abruptly, but it's still not too bad, and nice detail, the tome never touches the ground. He always keeps it safe. Like I mentioned earlier, this one has a sour and sweet spot on it. If you had trouble telling which one was which, I don't blame you. And then of course we've also got the 11 sword version. And again, no difference in sound effect. That's kind of disappointing. That version does feel pretty great to connect with overall, though. The only thing I strongly dislike about this one is the shoulder orientation, which is not a small deal, but it really only impacts one side. Not that that's particularly an excuse. In the animation world, there are tons of scenarios where you can get away with jostling stuff around if you know it's never going to be facing the player, but if they're going to be facing the player 50% of the time, that doesn't apply. Still, it's solid work in every other way. I really like the landing animation with the tome. That's a nice detail. I'll go A tier. Might as well do our final Fire Emblem character here. This is a very unusual stall and fall, both in terms of the concept. There's a dragon transformation going on. No one else does anything like that, but also some of the finer details. For the chamber animation, she crosses her legs as part of the coil up. That's very unusual. I don't think anyone else on the roster does that. It does work though, and she brings her arms down quite far under tension and then really thrusts them upwards to impart some more power to it. The pose she ends up in as she's falling is strange, but it does actually look pretty aerodynamic and has a strong silhouette on it. I'm not 100% convinced the sword needed to be just sticking out of the side like that. She could definitely have twisted her wrist a bit and had it more behind her. Would have made the silhouette look a bit smoother and more symmetrical, but not necessarily more distinctive. During the plunge, it's actually her feet that turn into the blades on the way down because Corrin has a lot of really disgusting hand and feet extensions. Once you start noticing it, it's pretty gross, but definitely creates a unique identity, part of the justification for having this character in the first place. And when she lands, the animators don't forget about the concept. That double-footed landing makes sense. It's a bit unusual looking, but everything about this animation is a bit unusual looking. I think it works, and I like the way she also uses her sword arm to catch herself. The way she gets up looks weak. It's a really crunchy, satisfying landing. There should be more of a push off there for sure. This is a multi-hit attack, and it definitely would look more multi-hitish if she spun around like a drill, but I think this works. I don't actually really find myself questioning it. A tier. And then I'll take a look at Hero, that other lingering sour spot example. Yep, there it is, and then you've also got that spiking sweet spot as usual. So you may think this is Robin's down air again, especially because it's another one-handed strike. He's holding the shield in this case, but it's actually more of a straightforward stab, which we don't really see all that much of. There's some nice shoulder orientation on this one. Look at that. Basically a complete 90 degrees from horizontal. This is great. This is what I want to see. This is an exaggerated animation. That applies to his overall silhouette too, which is kind of goofy looking. It's certainly not very sleek, but I do think it fits Hero. It comes across as very aggressive, but a little bit humorous as well. The shoulder orientation, even from this side, is noticeable. Yeah, you can't actually see both shoulders directly, but it's still obvious, right? Body mechanics are body mechanics. That's about as good a thrust as you can get out of that. Look at his sword arm, though. This is not a reverse grip, but then as soon as he touches the ground, it is in reverse grip for some reason, and then he needs to correct that, and that also means he needs to let go of his sword to make that correction, but as soon as he does, it starts sliding downwards of its own accord, which implies it's not stuck that deeply into the ground, and why would you not want it to look deeply stuck into the ground? That implies there's a lot of force behind the thrust, which is what you want to imply in the animation. So I really don't get basically anything that's going on there. I really like the actual attack, but that landing actively bothers me. I still certainly do weigh the attacks more heavily. I guess I'll let it maintain A tier, but it came close. That landing animation really was tempting me to drop it down a tier. Olimar, another downwards weapon swing, or close enough to a weapon swing. This one has some interesting momentum going on with it though. What's happening here? Okay, so this is odd. He swings downwards, but rather than following through on that momentum, he goes back directly the other way and then follows through on that momentum. So backtrack and then converts that into a spin. I guess that makes sense considering he does freeze in place and he's never facing entirely downwards. His body is mostly rotated that way, but not 100%. I'm hesitating because it does undeniably feel a bit odd, and also the thing is, Olimar has a very oversized head which should naturally want to rest at the bottom if it's given a chance. So in that case, even with the attack pose he freezes in, which doesn't send him entirely upside down, wouldn't the natural orientation be after that to have his head continue to sink to the bottom? So that would have him go completely upside down, and then convert that momentum so that he rotates the exact opposite way he currently does, so he does a front flip instead of a back flip. Because even at full gameplay speed and scale, I picked up on it right away. This doesn't feel quite right, and it does feel distinctive. I like the backflip animation itself, but I don't really know what it's doing here. And the Pikmin are not doing him any favors here. This animation doesn't really seem like it was designed with the Pikmin in mind at all. He flips directly through the middle of them. That's not great. It's actually pretty ugly looking. looking. He gets away with it more from this perspective, and Olimar's a character that has a bunch of individual entities moving around him all the time in different orientations. You just kind of have to accept a certain amount of clipping, but not on something like this. In this kind of situation, they absolutely did have the power to do something about that. The landing animation also sucks. The most important pose has his head facing towards the ground, and that's not used at all. I don't even care about the different Pikmin aspects or whatever. This is so clearly F tier. This might actually be my new least favorite Danar animation now that I've looked at it in more detail. Steve! We've got this very unusual anvil drop going on here. Right away, the thing that sticks out to me is the physics. I love the stall into the really just nasty feeling plunge, and the way it shakes the screen so aggressively when it lands. Like with Mr. Game & Watch, this is another character you have to evaluate on his own merits. Not nearly as drastically though. Case in point, he does react to the anvil hitting the ground, but I don't think it's the best way he could have reacted. He does have joints, right? And while his torso moves in the right direction, his head should have snapped down a bit too. Instead, it ends up facing more upwards, but at the same time, you always have to ask yourself, is this just a stylistic choice to match the vibes of Minecraft? Surprisingly tame sound effect on whiff. On hit. Pretty unmistakable, but it is a generic Smash sound, which is a bit surprising, but also kind of a relief. Smash imports a lot of Minecraft sound effects, and there is a dedicated anvil sound in there, but I've personally always thought it was way too harsh sounding. So you're not going to hear me complain about them leaving that behind. He can jump off it in the middle of the plunge, not too much to look at there. Steve barely has a jumping animation, and I like holding a scaled down version of the item beforehand. That's a nice bit of attention to detail. It's how it works in Minecraft. A tier for this one. I like the physics, and it's not really doing anything drastically wrong, but at the same time, how much praise can I really give it? It's not doing all that much of anything. Piranha Plant. Nice simple concept for this one. Piranha Plant does a stomp, and it does technically have feet, but realistically, there's only so much I can do with those, so it's much more a pot attack. It's putting a lot of force into this one. It's a full body flip. I gotta say, it doesn't come across nearly as powerful as I might expect. Having said that though, the acceleration into the final swing doesn't seem nearly exaggerated enough, and I could say the same for the overshoot. It just stops a bit too abruptly. I feel like they might have been able to get away with a bit more body breaking on the pot too, made it a little bit bigger, helped sell that sense of heftiness. It does have a spike on it, but it's very specific. It's pretty easy to miss by accident, and the animation doesn't really convey that all that well. I can easily buy that the part after the initial hit is a sour spot, but even then, there's actually quite a bit of it where it looks like the sour spot should still be active, but it's just not. The landing is also kind of whatever. There are plenty of instances where they squeeze a shocking amount of personality out of such a simple character, but that doesn't really apply here, or really to the entire animation. This is a C tier. Now about Palutena. So for Palutena, we've got this sweeping kick thing. Actually reminds me a little bit of the pits with that downwards arc. May well not be intentional, but at the same time, there is clearly some intentional overlap between them. It's a pretty forceful kick. I really like how much she winds her leg up into it. At the same time, the silhouette is kind of a mess, not only because her skirt is covering up part of what she's doing, but also because her torso does not really move cleanly along with it. It goes in the exact opposite direction. Body breaking doesn't just mean limbs getting bigger, it can also mean moving joints around unnaturally. That's a totally valid animation technique, but look at this and tell me it doesn't seem painful, and it's pretty prominently displayed in the animation. Usually with those kinds of joint overextension techniques, they're only on screen for a frame or two and not really intended to be consciously noticed. Here, that is her ending pose. And yeah, while I still really like the leg motion and the arc that it traces is very satisfying, I love how it's enhanced with those particle effects, this comes across as kind of messy, painful, and weird, and I do notice it very consciously. I like the way she lands initially. Falling on one hip makes a lot of sense, but her legs start moving instantly. There's not even really any time to appreciate the impact, because the second she touches the ground, it's already sliding back into position. It's much better on this side because the skirt covers up a lot of the blatant cheating, but you still do notice its shape changing right away. It feels good to land, and I like that they made the trajectory of grounded opponents follow the arc of the move. Feels very natural, and I love that she's putting a bunch of force into the kick. I don't doubt that at all, but yeah, it's a C tier. Greninja and Incineroar are looking lonely off in the corner there, and then we've still got Mewtwo and Lucario left, so you know what, let's just wind down the Pokemon. We've got another stall and fall, and we've got another stall and fall that bounces off people. This time around, I love the physics of this one, essentially the entire way through. Greninja shoots up pretty high and does a spin during the stall, and that creates a great sense of wind-up, and this one is synced really well. The way the feet extend down and the way the plummets start up are more or less totally matched. And when you put it all together, this one feels really nice to use. Greninja feels much heavier and more forceful than far bigger characters. And that's despite this not being a kill move and him not even driving into his opponent. Bowser. Banjo, what are your excuses? That bounce off is so good too. Very similar in principle to the Belmonts. Greninja did get there first, so that makes sense, but a little more exaggerated, a little more free feeling. Unlike the Belmonts, he's a ninja, so you want that. And you also want a ninja-ish feel to his landing animation, and that's exactly what he gives you. This entire thing looks so natural. I guess it helps when your idle animation is already basically a landing animation. For Incineroar, it's my good friend the stubby legs again. He has such tiny legs, and he uses them in so many attacks. There is definitely some body breaking going on with him here, but he still looks like a cone. That's not the only thing happening though. This is some of the most exaggerated tucking in you'll see on any Smash character. I love the way he brings his legs up to his chest. I love the way he puts his hands way down and then sends them shooting way up. Even his tail gets in on the action. That's a nice bit of attention to detail. I sometimes forget Incineroar even has a tail. He really doesn't utilize it that much. But even despite all that, this one still ends up feeling stiffer than some of his peers, and I think it's the lack of overshoot. He just goes into that pose and stays there. It is very noticeable in his legs while he's doing the stomp, but I would say it's even more noticeable in his arms. They just seem to snap from position to position, especially because the final pose he ends up in, it does look wrestlery, but it's also very rigid. It feels good to land. But I've looked at other examples of this attack archetype that do feel better, and he just can't get around those stubby legs, which he also has to land on, and... oh, that's actually quite good. I like the effort he puts in while he's getting up. Mewtwo does not have particularly stubby legs, thin legs maybe, but in either case helped out with a blast of psychic energy. I like the wind up and follow through on this one. There's enough leg swing to create a good sense of overshoot while still letting him settle into a final defined looking attack pose. Some of that gets a bit lost behind his body while he's rotating. It's not necessarily entirely clear whether he's doing a circular kick, which is the truth, or more of a straightforward downward stomp. The particle effects don't exactly help with that. They also get in the way a little bit, but I think whichever interpretation you have, the real one or the stomp one, they both read pretty well. This landing is fine, if not slightly slidey. I feel like they could have done a little bit more with the psychic floatiness there, but if you're feeling generous, you can also argue that you can use that to justify a bit more slidiness. It uses generic heavy fire sounds, and that applies to the sour spot and the sweet spot. That's always a bit disappointing. This does have a proper spike in the air, so I guess that's something. On grounded opponents, there's not really that much of a difference between landing the sour spot or the sweet spot anyways, so making it harder to react to isn't that big a deal, but would be nice. And then we get to Lucario, this double kick down with some very strange instant momentum halting properties on it. There's no difference in appearance on this one between no aura and full aura. There's also no difference in sound design. And that is a bit of a shame. I've always thought Lucario should have more of a universal dynamic sound system going on. I have always thought this is a slightly stiff feeling animation, and I think the reason for that is just because he doesn't bring his knees up essentially at all. It's extremely fast startup, so there's only so much they could do here. I think it could have been a bit more defined though. Some of that also just comes from Lucario's very high air movement that's instantly halted by a very straight silhouette that goes against the grain. Not much to be done about that, honestly. It's a functionality thing. You could argue that you could create a new animation that doesn't interfere with the air movement as much, but I think that's overkill. Not necessarily a worthy sacrifice of the concept. He bails out pretty hard in the landing animation like a lot of these flurry kicks tend to do, but he gets up pretty comfortably with no kind of push off. Okay, so Greninja, S tier. Easy. Incineroar, A tier. I like a lot of it, but it is a peg below the best stomps. Mewtwo, that'll be another A tier, and Lucario, I think, is more of a B tier. I do think the concept's a lot of fun, but even then, it's essentially just a more conservative version of an attack type we've seen multiple other examples of, right? And it doesn't adapt to his aura at all. I'm happy with that. Rob. This is another character that, at least to some extent, needs to be judged on his own standards, and another move where the thing that immediately jumps out to me about it is the physics. Yeah, that is snappy. It feels really nice to use. They ring some decent coiling up out of the mechanical parts. Probably could have been exaggerated a bit further if Rob's arms were moved to a slightly different position. That would have let the quote-unquote spine bend more, and they maybe could have enhanced the recoil more if the torso was allowed to bounce up and down freely on the spine, sort of like it does during the landing, much more subtly because it is already being pushed up. At the same time, locking into a rigid pose does feel appropriate for a robot. It's more so just demonstrated that it can have some bounciness to it, so, you know, why not take advantage of that? Because while that landing animation may be extremely simple, it is effective. It's some nice physics work. This has a spiking sweet spot and then a lingering sour spot as well, and yep, I would say the animation concept makes that pretty intuitive. Let's go A tier. Sora. This is a stall and fall. It might be the single strangest stall and fall on the roster. The startup for this one has always felt particularly strange, and looking at it in slow motion, I understand why. He does a backflip instead of a front flip, and that robs it of some power. It does make it look more distinctive and stylish, but I'm not really sure it necessarily needed help in that department, and Yeah, you open your attack up by having it go against the flow of gravity instead of using it to your advantage. For what it's worth though, he does take very good advantage of the direction he's working with. That's a nice clearly defined pose, and that landing, that's one of the best I've looked at. Lands hard but still has to account for the rotational momentum of the sword, strikes a nice clearly defined pose again, and then smoothly brings himself back up. That's just great. As with most of Sora's kit though, the sound design on this one is painfully bad. So little sense of impact on that one. I'm not a Kingdom Hearts fan, but I've had multiple Kingdom Hearts fans tell me that, yeah, they're not really that happy they imported those particular sound effects. That's pretty much my only major issue here, though. The fighting against gravity thing, okay, it's not ideal, but they do put it to good use. It's a pretty cool, distinct concept that's been well executed technically, especially on landing. That's way more attention to detail than most characters have to work with. I think S tier. I'll do Sonic, our final stall and fall of the video. This is a perfectly fine dive kick. It's another one of these nothing especially standout about it, nothing especially ugly about it kind of moves. It is a little more disappointing in the context of Sonic specifically though, because he's got other more iconic moves that I think would fit here better. This does show up on his canon moveset sometimes, but in a less recognizable way, and in the context of Smash is less distinctive, and it doesn't bounce off opponents like we've looked at a few times today, and Sonic's a character where that would be very appropriate. It's just a bit on the bland side where it didn't need to be. I really like how much he tucks his leg back in that chamber animation, but it's got a lack of overshoot issue. I still think it feels better to use than some of these, partially because the blue particle effects, funny enough, actually somewhat compensate for that. Sort of gives off the impression that his entire body is overshooting. I'm being pretty liberal with that definition there, but hopefully you know what I mean. The landing animation's not horrible, but there's no fun skid through on it, and he might do a tiny push off with his hand, but it barely looks like it if that's what he's doing. It's a B tier. It's fine, but doesn't really bring all that much to the table. Mega Man, the hard knuckle, a downwards projectile. This is an interesting one by Smash standards. You don't really tend to see this kind of thing pop up too much. It's more common in other platform fighters. It does make sense in context here though. It's more or less directly plucked out of his home series, like essentially all of Mega Man's moves. I don't really get what's going on with the two-stage chamber animation though. It doesn't really seem to contribute all that much to a feeling of power for the move. He puts his arm up, then down, and then shoots. It's not really much of a wind-up because he's more or less just moving between two discrete poses, and then his non-firing arm needs to actually get out of the way and then back into position there. At full speed and scale, it does give the entire thing kind of a rigid vibe. Now, Mega Man is based on the NES games, so he does borrow a lot of his attacks in Smash from sprite work. I always end up using this disclaimer. If you like that approach, that's great. I don't really, though. His model just looks too modern and not distinctive enough compared to someone like Steve or Mr. Game & Watch, so having him jump around doing all these weird jerky motions has always seemed odd to me. Feels just a bit out of place. Dan Air is far from the worst example on his kit, especially because he gets to still use conventional physics, which do feel pretty good, but it is a consideration. They cheat quite a bit with the gauntlet when it comes off Mega Man's body. It suddenly gets way bigger to help sell the impact better. They also cheat when he lands because he just gets it back in an instant. That's not really something you tend to worry about too much. Feels pretty good to connect with. In this context, I like the mix of 8-bit and modern sound design. I think I'm going to go A tier for this one, and some of that's the concept carrying it. Rosalina. Like with a lot of her moves, you've got a mix of two very different concepts. Rosalina's doing a gentle double-footed stomp with a halo below it, while Luma is just absolutely stepping on someone. I love how legitimately pissed Luma always looks in its attacks, and it's some nice physics work too. There's some fun juxtaposition. Rosalina has subtler movements than a lot of characters. Her arms don't go up and down anywhere near as much, and on this side, her lower body motion is almost entirely lost in the dress. Over here, it's a bit more clear what she's doing, but just barely. Her legs are technically attacking, but it's really the halo effect that's doing all the work, and you know what? That's fine. She's just clearly in the camp of, I don't really need to attack all that much because Luma and my magic will do it for me. That approach can fail spectacularly a lot of the time, but it doesn't here. It's handled well, and it has a very nice, flowing, elegant feeling to it, which is exactly what you want out of her. Her landing animation barely has any heft to it whatsoever. She catches herself again in a very elegant way. Yeah, in this context, it's a good fit. And if you're wondering about Luma's landing animation, it just simply does not have one. That's actually something that Rosalina players like from a gameplay perspective because it opens up a lot of techniques. This one has some odd properties to it. Rosalina's down air is a very reliable spike, but Luma's down air is not, and it really looks like it should be. As far as sound design goes, you've got Rosalina's magic, you've got Luma's physicality, and like with a lot of her attacks, I think it sounds best when you put them together. some slight functionality considerations aside, I think this is a home run in basically every other way. It's get missed here. Inkling. We got another Z-axis chop move, this time with a gun. Makes sense. I think the power feels a bit lacking on this one, but it does feel very bouncy and energetic, which is in line with Inkling. Yeah, it's not the furthest windup we've looked at today, but I think they probably wanted to have it more involved in the silhouette, and the way it's whipped down also seems a little bit too under control. The sensation of overshoot is more or less being carried by the gun getting briefly bigger and then shrinking back down again. Her arm largely just sort of locks into position, and she even manages to keep her wrist bent, which shouldn't really be happening if the gun was being thrown out with a lot of force. I talked about that with DDD's hammer as well. The landing animation's great on impact. I love that bounce, 1 foot coming off the ground a bit. On get up, it's fine. Again, no real push off. B tier, I don't feel too much about it. And then we just have Ganondorf bookending the video with the other big stomp. Yeah, this is another of Smash's most iconic moves, and even though Ganondorf is more hindered mobility-wise than a lot of characters, he can't flex as much, there's no elastic element to his attacks, he can't move his limbs around nearly as fluidly, he still does so much with so little. He brings his knees up incredibly high and launches his legs out so fast with some nice overshoot on it. He thrusts his chest out and snaps his head back, and his arms, they don't move nearly as far as some characters do, but they're so fast and so forceful. Such a clean, readable, iconic pose he ends up in. He gets some lightning particle effects on contact, which is at least vaguely in canon for Ganondorf. But honestly, he doesn't even need them. Even playing this move would still feel so good to land. The only part of this that's a bit mediocre to me is the landing animation. He hits the ground quite well, but the way he gets up is a little slidey, and this is a character that I really feel like should have to heave himself up. That's not happening. And even with the lightning, it's still not particularly canonically faithful. At the end of the day, it's a Captain Falcon ripoff, but who cares? This is S tier. Duh. And with that, we've got our full down air animation tier list, and I think that'll do it for today. Thanks for watching, everyone, and let me know what you thought of the list. Likes and comments are a big factor YouTube uses to gauge whether our video should be passed around to more people, so if you think this one deserved it, much appreciated. You can check out another MockRock Talk video here, a video from MockRock here, and patrons, members, and subs get fun perks like early videos and Discord access. Later, people.